Each NPC in Elden Ring is a world unto themselves. Some speak in riddles wound around ancient grief. Others offer warmth that costs more than gold to maintain. All of them exist at the intersection of who they were before the shattering and who the shattering made them become. We will sit with each of them tonight, not to judge or conquer, but simply to understand. Tonight, we move slowly through the lands between, not as warriors seeking conquest, but as wanderers pausing at the threshold of each soul we have passed without fully seeing. The people of this world carry histories heavier than the runes they leave behind. Before you drift any further, consider subscribing for more journey like this, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. The Lands Between has never been a forgiving place, even before the Elden Ring broke. But the souls who endure here are not merely obstacles, or vendors, or quest markers. They are the living memory of a civilization that tried and failed to hold itself together, and in their words, patient, layered, quietly devastating, that memory persists long. After the last graces faded, Roderica came to the Lands Between with a retinue. She was not alone when her journey began, and that fact matters more than it might first appear. She traveled with a group of companions, all of them intent on becoming champions of Marika, and all of them dying at Stormvale Castle before they ever had the chance to be. Remembered as anything other than grafted spirits, Roderica survived, not through strength or cunning, but through a disposition so gentle that the horror of her companions' ends did not harden her, but broke something open. Instead, she speaks of them plainly when you first find her in Stormvale's gatefront. She describes their grafted forms with a grief that has not yet learned to protect itself through distance. She is a woman still raw with the knowledge of what happened, and that rawness is what makes her remarkable among the Lands Between survivors. Most who endure learn to speak around their wounds. Roderica does not. Her gift for spirit tuning, for hearing the voices of the dead bound into spirit ashes, is not something she discovered through study or training. It is something she has simply always had. The dead speak to her, and she listens, and this communion with the grafted spirits at Stormvale is what the game presents as the first real sign of who she is beneath her fear. She says the spirits are cold and confused, and that they cling to their grafted forms because they do not understand yet that their journey ended there. When you encourage her to leave Stormvale and seek the Round Table Hold, she goes. She settles there quietly, near the fire, in a space that matches her disposition, warm and still, and slightly removed from the tension that runs through the rest of the holds. Halls. She does not know what to do with herself there initially, and that uncertainty is portrayed with a truthfulness that many games would not bother with. She is a person in the middle of becoming something, and the game allows her to be uncertain without making her passive. Her arc with Hugh is one of the quietest and most affecting in the game. The old blacksmith, chained to his forge, recognizes what she is before she does. He pushes her, in the blunt way of someone who has spent a long time listening to metal instead of people, toward the truth of her gift, and she receives his gruffness, not with resentment, but with a kind of patient affection that eventually becomes something close to care. When she becomes the Hold's spirit tuner, she settles into it with a calm that suggests she was always meant to land somewhere like this, a role of listening, of gentle mediation between the living and the dead, of making something difficult a little more navigable for those who pass through. She tells you, quietly, that she has found her place, and the way she says it carries the specific relief of someone who expected to die in Stormvale alongside the rest. Hugh, the blacksmith of the Round Table Hold, is chained to his anvil by a grace he did not choose and cannot leave. He does not complain about this in the theatrical way of someone seeking sympathy. He mentions it the way a person mentions a fact that has long since moved past the stage of being surprising. He is here, he is bound, and he will remain until whatever task the grace demands of him is complete. That task, as the game reveals through careful attention to his words, is the forging of a weapon capable of killing a god. He does not know who gave him this commission. He knows only that the dream remains, that it drives him to his work, and that his memory of its origin has been carefully removed by whoever placed it there. He has been made into an instrument, pointed at a purpose he cannot fully see. His gruffness toward you is real, but not unkind beneath its surface. He does not offer warmth, because warmth is not the language he speaks fluently. He offers his craft, which in his terms is the same thing. When he examines a weapon you bring him and tells you he can improve it, he is doing the closest thing to generosity that his nature permits. What makes Hugh quietly tragic is not the chain. It is the fact that the chain has been there long enough that he cannot clearly separate who he was before it from who he is now. He is a craftsman who has forgotten the circumstances of his greatest commission, performing that commission in the dark, serving a purpose that serves someone else's agenda, and doing it with the full dedication of a man who has decided that the work itself is worth doing regardless of who benefits. When Roderica comes to him and he recognizes her gift, his encouragement is blunt and slightly uncomfortable, which is to say, it is exactly how a person without social fluency expresses something they feel strongly. He does not say she has potential. He tells her, with the directness of someone who has spent their existence cutting through unnecessary material, that she should not waste what she is. He has made many weapons for many tarnished. Most of them did not return. The work continued regardless. That is the shape of his existence: devoted labor, uncertain results, and the quiet grace of a man who has decided that doing the thing well is its own justification. Fia, the deathbed companion who keeps her chamber near the Round Table Hold's hearth, offers something unusual among the NPCs of the lands between. She offers physical comfort. She asks if she can hold you. She wraps her arms around your character, and in doing so, transmits something she refers to as warmth, though what she actually transmits, as the game gradually reveals, is the blessing of death itself. She is not malicious in this. That is the first and most important thing to understand about Fia. She is not a predator using comfort as a lure. She is a practitioner of an ancient role, the deathbed companion, a figure who in the old traditions of the lands between was meant to tend to the dead and ensure that death's passage went cleanly and with dignity. She holds the dead. She holds the dying. She holds those who carry death within them. This is her calling, and she believes in it with a sincerity that the game does not undermine even as it reveals the full weight of what she carries. The fingerprint stone she gives you as a token of her warmth is, in practical terms, a debuff to your maximum health. This is the mechanical expression of something the lore communicates more subtly, that to be touched by death, to carry it close, has a cost. Fia is not hiding this cost. She tells you what she gives you. She does not tell you everything about what she takes, but neither does she conceal that something passes between you. Her questline moves through some of the most quietly devastating territory in the game. She is there to serve the Tarnished, who will become the Prince of Death, who will forge a path to an age of the Duskborn, an ending that offers the dead a kind of grace denied. To them, under the Golden Order, in which souls killed without grace could not return to the Erdtree and were simply lost. What Fia seeks is not domination or destruction. What she seeks is mercy for those who died badly. She found Godwyn the Golden, the firstborn of Marika, the one who was killed in body while his soul survived and lingered, trapped in the roots of the Erdtree and the Stone of Deeproot depths, and she lay with him. She held him as she held the dead. And from that union came something the game terms a mending rune, a piece of potential for a world that treats death more gently than the Golden Order ever allowed. Whether her choice was entirely her own or was shaped by the gravitational pull of older powers working through her is a question the game leaves appropriately open. But the grief with which she speaks of Godwyn is not performed. She found something in him, some beauty or some kinship, and it moved her. The deathbed companion who holds the dead found one she could not let go of entirely, and from that attachment came an entire alternate trajectory for the lands between. D, the Hunter of the Dead, is one of the first Tarnished you encounter who speaks in the clipped, certain language of someone who has decided what they believe and does not intend to revisit it. He He hunts the undead because the undead are an affront to the order he serves, the order of the Erd Tree, in which death is meant to proceed cleanly through the grace cycle back to the tree and to Marika. The undead are a disruption of that cycle. He removes disruptions. He is not a complicated man in the way that Fia or Roderica are complicated. His moral framework is clear to him, and he enforces it without the kind of reflective doubt that the game typically reserves for characters who have been broken by experience. But the complication with D is not internal, it is external. It arrives in the form of his brother. Fia kills D in the round table hold. She takes the armor he has been carrying, the armor that, when given to his brother Darian, allows Darian to take on his full identity and complete the Weathered Dagger quest that D himself began. The transaction is jarring in the way the game's most careful moments are jarring. It happens quietly, in a room you may or may not enter at the right moment, and it cannot be undone. Darian, encountered in Nokron's depths, is not D, or rather, he is D, before whatever happened that made D into a hunter who cannot afford doubt. He is softer, sadder, more aware of what he has lost. The armor D passed on is too large for him, in some sense, that has nothing to do with physical fit. He takes it anyway, because it is what he has left. The question the two brothers leave behind is not which of them was right. It is whether the certainty D built his identity around was always a fortress against feeling, and whether his brother, who never built that fortress, was left more vulnerable and more whole at the same time. Nephili Lu arrived in the lands between with a purpose she understood. She was the adopted daughter of Gideon Ofnir, the all-knowing, and she served as a warrior in service of the Elden Lord quest that defines the Tarnished's existence in the broader world. She fights with the ferocity of someone who has been raised to believe that strength is the most legible expression of worth. She wields paired axes with a style that communicates not just skill, but something close to fury. What the player gradually discovers about Nephili is that the Fury has a history more complicated than Warrior's Pride. She is not the biological daughter of Gideon. She is the daughter of Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, the man who was stripped of his grace and sent away from the lands between when his wars were finished, who became Huara, Lu the warrior in exile. She does not know this in the early parts of her questline. She knows only Gideon, and she knows that she fights for something she believes in. When Gideon's true nature becomes apparent, when his agenda of acquiring knowledge without allowing any tarnish to actually succeed clarifies itself, Nephili is shaken in a way that the game does not allow her to resolve quickly. She retreats to Stormvale Castle after the death of Godric, and she sits there in a kind of stunned stillness, as if the architecture of who she thought she was has been quietly demolished, and she has not yet figured out what to build in its place. The questline's resolution places her on the throne of Stormvale. It is a resolution that the game earns deliberately, through a series of quiet visits and conversations, and the delivery of a Stormhawk King spirit summon that restores something she had thought lost. She becomes a ruler, not because she sought power, but because the people of Stormvale needed someone to hold the space that Godric vacated, and Nephili, daughter of the first Elden Lord, raised by the man who sought all knowledge, trained by both to be something large, is exactly who that space required. Her father Godfrey, when he appears at the game's end, does not look at her with the specific warmth of a parent who has watched a child grow. He looks at her with the recognition of a man who sees in someone else the shape of what he once was. It is not a tender reunion, but it is a form of seeing, and in the lands between, to be seen accurately is its own form of grace. Gideon Ofnir, the all-knowing, sits at the round table hold and offers information with the generosity of a man who has decided that sharing knowledge costs him nothing as he controls what knowledge is shared. He is the hold's keeper of lore, its elder advisor, its most readily available source of orientation in a world that otherwise offers very little. And for much of the game, it is possible to read his helpfulness at face value. The truth of Gideon accumulates slowly. He knows more than he tells. The knowing is his resource, his advantage, his currency, and he hoards it with the care of a man who has built his entire identity around being the one who understands what others do not. He wants no tarnish to actually become Elden Lord. His gathering of knowledge about all the demigods and all the great runes is not in service of helping you. It is in service of a thesis he has arrived at through enormous study that becoming Elden Lord will result in catastrophe and that the shattering is preferable to the alternative. He is, in his way, not wrong about several things. He understands the greater will's relationship to the Erdtree more clearly than most. He understands that mending the Elden Ring without care could simply perpetuate an order that has already failed catastrophically. His mistake is not in his analysis, but in his method. He has decided that obstruction is better than transparency, that managing everyone else's choices is preferable to sharing the information that would let them choose for themselves. When he appears as an obstacle at the foot of the Erdtree, fighting you with the accumulated power of every great rune he has gathered through his research, he is not a villain, in the theatrical sense. He is a man whose intelligence outpaced his wisdom, who mistook understanding for permission, and who spent so long being the most informed person in any room that he forgot the difference between knowing what is happening and knowing what should happen. He calls you a fool at the end. He is, in the most specific sense, wrong about this too. The tarnished he could not stop proceeding past him is not a fool. They are simply someone who decided that living forward into uncertainty was preferable to the alternative he offered, which was an elaborate and well-researched form of standing still. Sorceress Selen carries within her the compressed grief of a woman who loved a discipline and was severed from it so completely that the severing left something broken behind. She was a glintstone sorceress of extraordinary ability, a primeval current sorcerer who glimpsed the deepest laws of how the stars shape magic in the lands between. She was expelled from the Academy of Raya Lucaria, not for failure, but for what her colleagues judged to be transgression. She had experimented with ways of thinking about sorcery that the Academy found dangerous, and so she was removed, and her work was driven underground, and she became what you find when you locate her, a teacher without an institution, a scholar without a library, a mind of extraordinary reach working in secret, because the established order decided it, could not hold her. Her questline moves through betrayal and transformation in ways that are difficult to look at directly. The allies she gathers to restore her position in the Academy turn on her at the quest's resolution, and the restoration she achieves is not a restoration at all, but an incorporation. She becomes what the primeval current always threatened, a being subsumed into the stream of sorcerous force she spent her life studying. Whether this is liberation or loss is a question the game deliberately refuses to answer clearly. The ball of human-like flesh encountered in the Academy's depths, which is either Selen at a different stage or the result of her imprisonment under the Witchbane ruins, speaks to the Academy's willingness to perform cruelties on those it judges to have transgressed. The institution that expelled her did not simply remove her, it imprisoned and transformed those who carried her dangerous knowledge, because the Academy understands, as all institutions understand, that ideas do not die when there. Proponents are silenced, they go underground, they find students, they continue. Selen's investment in teaching the tarnished is not purely strategic, though strategy is certainly present. She is genuinely interested in the mind that comes to her curious. She pushes her students. She is demanding in the way of someone who takes the subject seriously enough to believe that sloppiness is disrespectful to the material. And in those moments of demanding engagement, the scholar she was before the expulsion is entirely visible, whole, alive, committed to a truth that no institution could quite contain. Alexander, the Iron Fist, is a warrior jar whose first appearance involves him being wedged upside down in a hole in the ground in Limgrave, calling out for assistance with the specific dignity of a being who has decided that even embarrassing circumstances deserve to be navigated with some composure. He wants to become a great warrior. He is a jar filled with the remains of fallen warriors. This is what the jar people of the lands between are, vessels containing the compacted history of fighters who came before, and he has decided to add to that history by becoming formidable himself. He is, across the length of his quest line, one of the most purely cheerful presences in the game. This is not the cheerfulness of naivety. Alexander has fought enough to understand that fighting is dangerous, and that most who pursue the warrior's path do not arrive at the destination they imagined. He chooses cheerfulness anyway, the way someone might choose a particular coat for a long journey, deliberately, because it is better than the alternative, and because warmth is worth carrying. His encounters across the lands between track the player's progression in a way that feels like genuine companionship. He shows up where strong things gather. He is drawn to great battles the way certain people are drawn to large fires on cold nights, not out of recklessness, but out of a kind of gravitational pull toward the thing. That matters most to them. For Alexander, what matters most is the test of becoming. The end of his quest line requires the player to fight him. He is full, packed so completely with the essence of fallen warriors that he cannot hold more, and he asks you to crack him open to allow what he has gathered to be released, so that those essences might continue their journey. He is grateful for the fight. He is grateful for the ending. He faces it with the same composure he brought to being stuck in a hole in Limgrave, which is to say, he faces it as someone for whom the form of a thing matters as much as its outcome. His ashes, which become available after this encounter, carry the compressed energy of everything he gathered. To summon him in battle is to summon not just Alexander, but the accumulated purpose of every fighter he held, every battle he witnessed, every moment he chose cheerfulness in the face of the difficult and the uncertain. Blade the half-wolf is the shadow of Ranni the witch, a sworn protector bound to her through a covenant that is older than his memory and runs deeper than his conscious allegiance. He is not simply her bodyguard, he is her shadow in the literal and metaphysical sense, a being whose purpose is so thoroughly defined by another's existence that when that existence moves in a direction he cannot follow, his own coherence begins to fracture. He is first encountered in Mistwood, howling from a ruin in a way that initially reads as threatening and quickly resolves into something else. He is calling for company, not prey. Company. He wants to know who else is moving through this part of the world with enough attentiveness to hear him and respond. The howl is a test, and when you pass it, he greets you with the easy warmth of someone who has been waiting for someone interesting to come along. His loyalty to Ranni is total but not blind. He knows what she is doing. He knows the weight of what she has chosen. He follows her into the shadow of the Erdtree, not because he has been commanded to, but because she is the reason for his form and his focus, and to abandon that focus would be to abandon something fundamental about who he is. The covenant between a witch's shadow and the witch herself is not simply employment, it is identity. What breaks him at the end of his quest line is not Ranni's departure. It is what the Two Fingers and the Golden Order, in their fear of what Ranni represents, attempt to make of him. The shadow of a witch, who defied the greater will, is unacceptable to the powers that maintain that will's presence in the world, and so the attempt is made to hollow him, to turn the loyalty that is his nature into something weaponized and terrible. You find him at the end, in the ruins of Ranni's Rise, mad, howling, a shadow without a witch to give it shape. He is not reduced to a monster. He is a person unmade by the forces that could not let the connection he represented simply end cleanly. Putting him to rest is the final act of the quest line, and it carries the specific weight of mercy extended to someone who deserved better than what the world allowed them. Ranni herself requires patience to understand, and she knows this, and she tests it deliberately. She appears first as a puppet of herself, a small doll's form, cold blue, speaking in the slightly removed cadence of someone who has learned to present a version of themselves. That is easier for others to manage than the truth. She will work with the tarnished. She will offer a path. She will not explain the full nature of that path until the tarnished has demonstrated through sustained engagement that they can be trusted with larger pieces of the picture. She is the daughter of Radagon and Renala, which makes her the granddaughter of Marika herself, a detail the game does not foreground, but which shapes everything about her. Position. She was given a two fingers at birth, as all demigod children were, the physical form of the greater will's guidance, meant to orient its charges toward the order that the will maintained. She rejected her two fingers. She killed it. This is not a small act. It is the most fundamental act of defiance available to a being in her position, and she committed it deliberately and bore the consequences of it for the rest of her existence. Her plan, to separate the greater will's influence from the lands between, to place the rune of death beyond the reach of the cosmological forces that have used it as a management tool for the lives and deaths of every being in the world, is audacious in proportion to what she understands about the architecture of the world's order. She has studied the history. She has mapped the dependencies. She knows what she is attempting to undo and why it needs undoing, and she has decided that the cost, which for her includes a form of death and a form of exile, is worth the outcome she is working toward. The cold she projects is not indifference. It is the temperature of someone who has been carrying a very large thing for a very long time and has learned to compress themselves around it so completely that warmth is a luxury they have not been able to afford. When she thanks you at the end of her quest line, genuinely, quietly, in the specific language of someone who has not had much practice at it, the warmth that surfaces is not performed. It is real, and it is rare, and it illuminates everything that the cold was protecting. Patches the Untethered appears across the entire history of From Software's worlds in one guise or another, wearing different names and different faces, but always the same. Essential character, a man who has built a life around avoiding the costs that others pay, and who, beneath that avoidance, carries something complicated that occasionally surfaces against his own intentions. He is a rogue. He is a coward. He is also, in his way, honest about being these things. In the lands between, he follows his established pattern with professional precision. He lures you into a chest that teleports you to a distant tomb. He pushes you from ledges. When his health drops in combat, he throws up his hands and surrenders with the theatricality of someone who has practiced this exact gesture many times. He sells you the things he took from you after trapping you, at prices that are only slightly outrageous. What makes Patches interesting is not the comedy of his consistent self-interest. It is the specific places where his self-interest fails to fully cover him. The dancer's castanades he asks you to deliver to Lady Tanith are a gift from a person trying, in the only language available to them, to offer comfort to another person in grief. He cannot say this directly. He cannot frame it tenderly, because tenderness is not a mode he has practiced or allowed himself. So he routes the gift through a quest, packages it as a delivery, and hopes it lands. That Tanith cannot receive the castanets, that she has moved so far into grief that the language of her old life no longer reaches her, is a quiet tragedy that Patches himself may not fully understand. He returns to Murkwater Cave, untethered as always, living out his days in the place where his particular story in the lands between began. The game has given him, in its way, a continuity that looks like survival and contains, somewhere inside it, the residue of an attempt at kindness that did not quite find its target. His recurring presence across From Software's worlds is not simply a developer and joke, though it is that too. It suggests something about the kind of person who survives catastrophe, not the heroic, not the pure, but the adaptable, the self-serving, the one who has decided that the most important thing is to keep going and worry about nobility later, where later is an address they have no real intention of visiting. Tanith, the proprietor of Volcano Manor, carries herself with the posture of someone who has made a complete and final commitment. She is not conflicted. She is not uncertain. She has organized her entire existence around a single center, Rykard, the Lord of Blasphemy, the demigod who fed himself to the serpent god and merged with it in the depths of the volcano, and from that center she operates with a clarity that is both admirable and entirely consuming. The manor she runs is a household of assassins. Its mission, delivered through letters that arrive with the phrasing of invitations rather than commands, is to draw tarnished into service, to use them as instruments in thee. Removal of others pursuing the grace of the Erd Tree. Reichard's heresy is absolute. He has rejected the greater will and the Erd Tree entirely, and his manor is the material expression of that rejection, a place where those who also feel the pull of defiance are gathered and pointed at the world that excluded them. Tanith herself was, before Volcano Manor, a dancer. The evidence for this lives in item descriptions, in the proportions her armor conceals, in the specific object that Patches asks you to deliver to her, a pair of dancers. Castanets, the kind of instrument used in performances from a foreign land, a land that Tanith appears to have originated from before she arrived in the lands between and entered. Reichard's orbit. She was a performer who became a consort, who became the keeper of a manor devoted to the lord she chose to devote herself to. The scene of her final state, kneeling over Reichard's corpse in his chamber, consuming what remains of him, is one the game presents without editorial comment. She is not presented as mad. She is presented as a person in grief, whose grief has taken the only form available to it in the circumstances she is in. She has nothing left to maintain the fiction of composure for. The manor is empty of purpose. The lord she served is dead. And so she does what she can with what remains, which is to keep him close in the only way still possible. There is something in this that the game asks you to sit with, not to judge or to explain away, but simply to recognize as the extremity of a particular kind of devotion, the kind that has no safe distance built into it, no mechanism for stepping back, no contingency for the world in which the sinner does not hold. Millicent arrived in the lands between from the Aeonia swamp, carrying within her body the scarlet rod of Melania herself, born from the goddess's blooming in a way that ties her, biologically and metaphysically, to one of the most fearsome and tragic forces in the world. She did not choose this origin. She did not choose to be born where she was born, to whom she was born, and to the condition she carries. She woke into an existence already defined by forces much larger than herself, and spent her questline deciding what to do about that. The unalloyed gold needle, which you can acquire and give to her, suppresses the rot that would otherwise consume her. It is a tool for holding the line between herself and the disease that wants to become her, a way of remaining Millicent rather than becoming a vessel for Millennia's will. She accepts it with the specific gratitude of someone who has been given the possibility of a different story than the one their body was trying to tell. Her journey retraces Millennia's steps, not because she is following orders or fulfilling a prophecy, but because she has decided to understand who she came from, to face that inheritance on her own terms rather than running from it. She seeks Melania not out of worship, but out of the specific need of a person who wants to understand the shape of what was handed to them before deciding whether to accept or reject it. At the Halatry, after she has fought her sisters and survived, she pulls the needle from her own body. This act is understood differently depending on how a player has engaged with her questline, but its core is unmistakable. It is a choice. She is choosing her own end, on her own terms, over the transformation that would have made her into exactly what Gowry always intended, a Scarlet Valkyrie, a servant of the Rot goddess, a weapon in a war she never agreed to fight. Her final words, spoken quietly beside the poison pool where she chooses to rest, carry the weight of someone who has arrived at the end of a long and difficult road and is not, entirely without peace about it. She did not get the life she might have chosen. She got the ending she chose, which is a different and in some ways more important thing. Gowry, the elderly sage whose shack sits near Celia and Kalid, is not a man. He presents as a man, warm, grandfatherly, patient, offering guidance and context with the manner of someone who simply wants to help. But when you attack him, the illusion dissolves to reveal a kindred of rot, one of the chitinous insect-like creatures that inhabit the rot-soaked regions of the lands between, and that worship the scarlet disease as a kind of sacrament. Everything Gowry told you was structured around a purpose. Every gentle word, every patient instruction, every expression of concern for Millicent was in service of a plan he had been working since before she could remember him. He found Millicent and her sisters as infants in the Aeonia swamp, born from Melania's blooming, and raised them with the intention of ensuring that Millicent would, eventually, complete her transformation into a scarlet Valkyrie, a warrior fully realized by the rot, capable of serving at Melania's side. What is unusual about Gowry, and what makes him more interesting than a simple villain, is that he believes in his purpose with complete sincerity. He is not performing devotion, he is devoted. He describes Millicent's loss of her memories of him, a consequence of the rot's progression, as one of his deepest griefs. He loves her in the specific way that a creature entirely organized around a sacred purpose can love something, as the fulfillment of that purpose, as the beautiful expression of the thing he serves, as a bud moving toward a flower that he finds genuinely, terrifyingly magnificent. When you carry Millicent's questline to its completion, and she chooses her own end rather than the transformation Gowry shaped her toward, his reaction suggests that the loss registers in him as something real. He is a servant of rot who raised someone with tenderness toward an end she refused. The tenderness and the agenda coexisted in him without contradiction, because in the theology of the Scarlet Rot, those two things are not opposites. They are both expressions of devotion to the same sacred cause. Kenneth Haight, the self-possessed lord with an unfortunate shortage of followers, presents himself with the absolute certainty of a man whose confidence outpaces his circumstances by a significant margin. He is camped out on a ruined fort in Limgrave, with no army, no garrison, and no evident path to the lordship he considers his by right, and he discusses this situation with the tone of someone describing a minor logistical inconvenience rather than a complete absence of power. He wants Limgrave's Stormvale Castle restored to proper order and himself installed as its legitimate lord. He does not appear to have given enormous thought to how this will happen, but the certainty with which he holds the outcome as inevitable is, in its way, impressive. He is a man whose internal map of the world has himself at its center, and he navigates by that map with the commitment of someone who has never seriously entertained the possibility that the map might be inaccurate. His questline connects to Nephili Loux in a way that the game does not announce loudly. When Nephili takes the throne of Stormvale, and Kenneth learns that the new Lord of Limgrave is not himself, but a woman trained by Gideon Ofnir and descended from the first Elden Lord, his reaction is, given what we know of him, surprisingly gracious. He finds his way to Stormvale and accepts a role in service of someone else's lordship, which suggests that beneath the performance of certainty there is a person capable of recognizing legitimacy when it arrives in a form he did not expect. He is not a major figure in the larger story of the lands between, but he is a specific kind of figure that the world needs, someone who holds a space open through sheer insistence on the possibility that order might be restored, who occupies a position loudly enough that when order eventually arrives it has somewhere to land. Rogier, the sorcerer who spreads his bedroll near the round table holds grace, carries a secret that the game reveals to attentive players through item descriptions and careful conversation rather than through dramatic exposition. He fought his way to the roots beneath Stormvale Castle, where Godwyn the Golden, the first demigod to die, killed in body while his soul survived, had taken root in the stone, and begun to spread. Rogier touched those roots. He survived the touch, and in surviving it, he received something he did not seek, a connection to the death blight that now moves through him slowly and will eventually take him. He knows this. He is one of the few characters in the game who carries the full awareness of his own ending without either dramatizing it or suppressing it. He mentions his condition in the way of someone who has processed it enough to be able to discuss it calmly, without the performance of either courage or despair. He is dying. He was a scholar and a fighter, and he is dying, and the thing that is killing him is one of the most cosmologically significant forces in the game's world, and he holds this knowledge with a composure that says a great deal about who he is. His interest in the Black Knife assassins who killed Godwin, in the rune of death that was stolen, and the night of the Black Knives that changed the shape of everything is A. Scholar's interest, not a warrior's. He wants to understand. He has always wanted to understand, which is presumably part of what drove him to Stormvale's roots in the first place. The understanding that cost him his life is the same understanding that makes him one of the most useful sources of orientation in the game's early chapters. When he fades, when the death blight claims him fully, and he passes from the hold in the way that people in the lands between pass when they have nothing left that requires them. To remain, his parting words are gentle. He does not leave in anger or in bitterness. He leaves as someone who looked at the world as carefully as they could, for as long as they were able, and found, even in the looking, sufficient reason to have done it. Preceptor Miriam, encountered in the Karya Manor Tower, makes herself immediately clear. She is not here to help you. She fires sorceries from a position of height, retreating to the next floor whenever you close the distance, using the tower's architecture as a tool the same way she uses thee. Academy's spells. She is not a boss in the sense that most bosses are bosses. She is a challenge of a different kind, a problem that requires attention to space and movement rather than thee. Management of a health bar. She was placed in Karya Manor as a sentinel, maintaining the wards and defenses of the Karyan royal family's ancestral home. That family, Renala, Radon, Rani, Rykard, has largely scattered by the time the player arrives, and the manor is occupied mostly by its own history and the spirits of those who served it. Miriam continues to serve, which is either impressive loyalty or a kind of inertia so deep it has become indistinguishable from loyalty, and the game does not lean strongly in either direction. What she demonstrates, in her way, is something about the Karyan legacy, that the Academy of Raya Lucaria produced sorcerers of real competence and real coldness, practitioners for whom magic was a craft to be deployed with precision rather than a source of wonder to be engaged emotionally. She is clinical. She is effective. She does not explain herself or offer you a reason to understand her. She simply executes her function, which is to prevent your advance. In a game full of characters whose complexity accumulates through extended conversation and carefully placed item descriptions, Preceptor Miriam is notable for being fully herself through action alone. You understand exactly who she is by the end of the tower encounter without her having said a word that explained her nature. Sometimes the clarity of a life in motion is its own kind of characterization. Hyetta, the maiden who asks for grapes and moves slowly through the lands between, following a vision that she herself does not fully understand, is one of the game's most patient questlines and one of its most surprising revelations. She is blind, or effectively so. What sight she has is oriented towards something other than the physical world. She is following a light that others cannot see, moving toward a purpose she cannot describe precisely, asking only for a specific and unsettling kind of nourishment along the way. The grapes she requests are not ordinary grapes. They are Shabriri grapes, and the name Shabriri is significant. Shabriri was the last person to bear the curse of the three fingers before it passed, and the grapes that carry. His name are the eyes of those who have received a particular kind of blessing or madness, depending on how you read it. What Hyetta is consuming along her path is, in material terms, the processed sight of others. She eats eyes to see the light that the three fingers cast. She is moving toward the frenzied flame, the sub-god of chaos and heat and dissolution that lives beneath the lands between in the depths below Lendel. She does not frame it as a catastrophic destination. She frames it as a homecoming, a calling, the warmth she has been seeking through all the darkness of the world as she has navigated it. Her blindness is not presented as deprivation. It is presented as an orientation toward a frequency of light that most people are fortunate enough not to perceive. At the frenzied flame prescription, she makes her final choice. She becomes a finger maiden of the three fingers, a role that mirrors the finger maidens of the Two Fingers, committing herself to the Lord of Frenzied Flame in whatever age. That commitment will serve. Her peace in this moment is genuine. She has arrived. The path that looked from the outside like wandering was, from the inside, the most direct route available to her. Insha of the royal remains, who occupies a position in the round table hold with the particular stillness of someone who is choosing to be still rather than being quiet by nature, is one of the hold's most uncomfortable presences. He says very little. What he does say is opaque. He watches. When the player has made sufficient progress in their journey, he attacks, without provocation, without declaration, without the kind of context that would make the violence intelligible in human terms. His armor, the royal remains set, tells the story that he will not. He was a member of a royal family that no longer exists in any form recognizable as intact, consumed by the rot or the shattering or the long night, the details distributed. A cross-item descriptions the way the game distributes all of its most essential information. What he is now is a person reduced to the final layer of themselves, the layer that remains when everything else has been removed, the compulsion to act, the residue of an identity that was once attached to something larger. He is not, in the end, a major figure in the game's lore, but he serves a function that goes beyond the small story contained in his armor descriptions. He is evidence that the Round Table hold, which presents itself as a place of relative safety and cooperation, is not actually neutral ground. The things gathered there are held together by the gravity of purpose, and when that gravity is disturbed sufficiently, what was always present becomes visible. The silence of him, the specific quality of a character who says almost nothing and then acts suddenly and violently, is a kind of characterization that the game uses with care. It speaks to the nature of the shattering's survivors, people who have compressed themselves to almost nothing, who maintain a surface of functionality over states they cannot articulate, who live at the edge of coherence and sometimes cross it without warning. Brother Corin arrived at the Round Table hold with his faith intact. He is a servant of the Two Fingers, a practitioner of Erdtree incantations, a believer in the Golden Order who carries that belief with the quiet consistency of someone for whom faith is not a performance, but a practice. He is not remarkable in the way that several of the hold's other residents are remarkable. He is simply there, offering incantations to those who want them, maintaining his devotion in a place where devotion to the Erdtree is surrounded by the evidence of its inadequacy. His questline is inseparable from Goldmask, the figure he eventually encounters and follows, an emaciated man in a golden mask who stands in silence at various locations across the lands between, meditating on questions about the nature of the greater will and the proper form of the Golden Order. Goldmask cannot communicate in ordinary language. Corin serves as his interpreter, his companion, the one who notices the positions of his hands and the direction of his gaze and attempts to extract meaning from them. This relationship is one of the game's most careful portraits of faith in motion. Corin believes. Goldmask questions, or rather, Goldmask is engaged in a form of inquiry so deep that it looks from the outside like a different kind of believing. Together they are working toward a mending rune that would restore the Golden Order in a form purified of the compromises and corruptions that made the original fall. They believe, each in his own way, that the Order can be saved, and that the saving is worth doing. The ending of their questline is quiet and terrible. Goldmask reaches his conclusion, the conclusion that the Golden Order cannot be mended without the return of the Greater Will's direct involvement, and acts on it, and the act destroys him. Corin, who followed this man across the lands between and staked his faith on the destination they were both heading toward, is left alone with the evidence that the inquiry concluded somewhere he cannot follow. Enia, the finger reader who speaks on behalf of the Two Fingers at the Round Table hold, occupies a role that is older than almost anything else in the game's world. She reads the fingers, the physical forms through which the Greater Will communicates its will to the people of the lands between, and she conveys what she reads to those who need to hear it. She is a medium, in the old sense, a person who serves as a conduit between the cosmic and the immediate. She is ancient, not in the way of someone who has simply lived a long time, but in the way of someone who carries the accumulated weight of a tradition that predates most of the things the player encounters. The two fingers themselves are older than the Erdtree in a meaningful sense. They predate the current form of the Golden Order, belonging to an older covenant between the greater will and the world. Anaya carries that age in her bearing. She speaks about the Elden Lord quest with the reverence of someone who understands, better than anyone in the hold, exactly what is being asked of the Tarnished and exactly why. It matters. She does not oversimplify the gravity of what you are working toward. She does not pretend that the outcome is assured. She extends what the two fingers require, the great runes, the journey to the Erdtree, the act of becoming capable of mending what was broken, and she does it with the authority of someone who has been preparing for exactly this moment for much longer than any single tarnished lifespan. Her grief, when the two fingers finally fall silent, is the grief of someone whose entire orientation toward the world has been structured around a presence that is no longer communicating. She has spent her existence listening to something that has gone quiet. What she does with that silence is one of the game's quieter open questions, and it sits at the edge of the hold's narrative without demanding resolution. Dialos Hoslo arrived at the Round Table hold with his household knight, Lanya, and a purpose he articulated with the heat of genuine emotion. He would find who had hurt Lanya, and make them account for it. He is a man of the old nobility, shaped by a tradition in which family honor was maintained through direct and personal action, in which the appropriate response to harm done to those in your care was to respond with force on their behalf. Lanya is dead before the player encounters Dialos at the hold. The harm has already been done. What Dialos is carrying is the specific anguish of someone who failed to prevent what they swore to prevent, and is now left to decide what to do with the aftermath of that failure. He does not process this quietly. He processes it loudly, passionately, in the manner of a person who is trained to express everything through the lens of honor rather than the vocabulary of grief. His journey takes him to Volcano Manor, where he joins the assassins for reasons that intersect with his need to do something, anything that feels like action in the face of what happened. He takes on a manner of coldness there, a performance of ruthlessness that sits uncomfortably on him because ruthlessness is not actually who he is. He is a man with a large and poorly defended heart, trying to armor it in the style of his family's tradition, and the armor does not quite fit. When he arrives eventually at the Jar Bairn in the Jarburg settlement, where he finds a kind of purpose in protecting the small Jar people that the hold in the manor could not offer him, the relief in his manner is visible. He is not a warrior who needed a war. He is a person who needed somewhere to belong and something to protect that did not require him to perform a version of himself he was never quite capable of sustaining. Jar Bairn, the small Jar child who sits in the doorway of a house in Jarburg, speaks with the direct simplicity of someone who has not yet learned to complicate what they actually think. The Jar people, as a whole, are among the more unusual creations of the Lands Between's world, clay vessels filled with the compacted remains of warriors, animated by some spirit of the land into beings who think and feel and aspire, and are occasionally stuck in holes in the ground in Limgrave. Jar Bairn is the youngest of them, and in the youngest is most visible the essential quality of Jarfolk existence, the unself-conscious combination of fragility and determination. Jar Bairn wants to become a great champion Jar. This aspiration sits alongside Alexander's aspiration, the way two different expressions of the same fundamental desire sit alongside each other, recognizable as related. Differentiated by scale and circumstance, Alexander is already large and already on his journey. Jar Bairn is small and at the beginning of everything. What makes Jar Bairn interesting is not the cuteness that the game's design leans into gently, but does not exploit. It is the questline's quiet examination of inheritance. Jar Bairn wants to be what Alexander was. Alexander's path ended in a particular way. The things Alexander gathered and experienced and chose will live on in the Tarnished, who carries his ashes, and in the memory of those who witnessed his journey. Jar Bairn is next, and the game does not tell you exactly what that will mean, only that it will mean something. The Jarberg itself, a small and peaceful community of Jar people in the cliffs of Liurnia, represents something the lands between rarely affords, a place that is attempting, in its small way, to simply exist without violence. It is not successful at this entirely, the world finds it, as the world finds all such places, but the attempt is genuine, and the attempt is worth something. Yura, Hunter of Bloody Fingers, is introduced hunting a dragon on the Agiel Lake shore, with the patience of someone who has been at this for long enough that hurry seems beside the point. He is a tarnished who has dedicated himself not to becoming Elden Lord or accumulating power, but to the specific task of hunting down the Bloody Fingers, the servants of Moog, Lord of Blood, who invade other players' worlds and leave behind a trail of madness and violence. He is practical in a way that the game's more philosophically inclined characters are not. He does not have a grand theory of the world. He has a clear sense of what is wrong, the Bloody Fingers, and the spread of the Formless Mother's influence through Moog's cult, and a commitment to addressing it through the most direct means available. He hunts. He advises the tarnished who runs into him. He moves with economy. His questline involves a complication that the game introduces with characteristic quietness. The man you have been following, the hunter whose guidance you have been accepting, is revealed not to be Yura in his original form. He is Yura possessed, or inhabited, or guided by the spirit of Shabriri, the last bearer of the frenzied flame curse before the game's present moment. Shabriri has been working through Yura, using the hunter's body and relationships and reputation to reach the tarnished and encourage them toward the frenzied flame. This revelation reframes everything Yura said and everything he appeared to be working toward. The practical hunter of Bloody Fingers was real. The body and the history were real. But the intelligence guiding the later parts of the questline was not Yura's. It was Shabriri's, and Shabriri's interest is in a very different destination than the one Yura was steering toward. The game uses this to ask something about identity and possession, and the difference between who someone is and who is speaking with their voice. Dung Eater, imprisoned in the subterranean shunning grounds and accessible through the Round Table Hold's back passage, is among the game's most deliberately uncomfortable. Characters. He is foul. He announces himself as foul. He has constructed an identity around being foul in the specific way of someone who has decided that transgression against the established order is a form of power, and who has pursued that transgression with enough commitment that it has become his essential nature rather than simply a choice he makes. His project, the Blessing of Despair, the mending rune he works toward, seeks to curse all life in the lands between with the same defilement that he spreads through thee. Physical desecration of corpses. The Golden Order requires that the dead return to the Erd Tree through grace. The Dung Eater's curse prevents this return, ensuring that every person affected by it dies in a state the Erd Tree cannot absorb. He is, in his way, attacking the mechanism of the Golden Order at its deepest level. Not through philosophy, not through political opposition, but through a kind of systematic ritual pollution. The game does not ask you to sympathize with him. It asks you to understand him clearly enough to use him. His questline produces a mending rune that becomes available for the Blessing of Despair ending, and what becomes clear in that understanding is that he is not random. His hatred of the Golden Order's clean categories, of the Erd Tree's insistence on sorting the dead into the acceptable and the unabsorbable, connects him to other strands of the game's lore about what the Order costs those it excludes. He is the extreme expression of something the game returns to again and again, the violence of order, the things excluded and defiled by the demand for purity, the lives that fell outside the grace cycle and were simply lost. He chose to embody that exclusion rather than mourn it. Whether that choice contains anything redemptive is a question the game does not resolve, and the refusal to resolve it is honest. Bernal, the knight of Volcano Manor who first presents as a teacher of war ash techniques, is one of the NPCs whose trajectory tracks closely with the player's own decisions in a way that makes him feel like a genuine presence in the world rather than a fixed quest object. He is at the manor because he has found, in Rykard's blasphemous rejection of the greater will, a framework that his own disillusionment with the Golden Order can inhabit. He is a man whose faith in the established order broke some time before the player encounters him. He gives you techniques. He participates in the manor's assassination missions with the professionalism of someone for whom the work itself is what matters after the belief in the work's larger purpose has gone. He is, in the manor's terms, one of the more composed of its members, doing what is required, functioning in the structure that Tanith maintains, without the kind of visible desperation that some of the manor's other residents carry. His quest eventually takes him to the Farum Azula, the storm-battered city outside of time that sits at the crumbling edge of the Lands Between's cosmology, where he appears as an invader in the late game. His presence there is not explained by a single clear motivation. He has followed something, the collapse of the structures he was working within, the need to be somewhere that the conventional order has stopped applying, the gravity of a place where time itself has frayed, and he ends there, at the edge of the world's unraveling, which is where people who no longer believe in the sinner tend to eventually arrive. The war ashes he teaches, the techniques he shares with the tarnished he encounters, persist past his own story. The knowledge moves forward even when the person who held it does not. Raya, the young woman who asks you to recover a necklace in Liurnia, and whose pleasant manner conceals a growing discomfort that she is working very hard not to show, is carrying one of the game's more carefully constructed secrets. She is the daughter of Tanith. She was given the necklace as a child, and it is, among other things, an image of the woman she was separated from, or who was separated from her, or who released her, depending on how you read what Tanith's relationship to the Volcano Manor ultimately permitted. She leads you to Volcano Manor with the poise of someone performing competence while managing anxiety. She is an agent of the manor, but she is new enough to the role that the performance of cold assurance that the manor cultivates in its members has not fully taken hold. She is still, underneath the manor, a person navigating a complicated inheritance. What she discovers about herself, that she is not fully human, that her true form, revealed when she consumes a particular item you can offer or withhold, is the serpentine. Shape of one of Rykard's lineage is handled with a fragility that the game earns by having established her poise so carefully first. The discovery costs her something. It reorders who she understood herself to be. She asks you how you see her after the revelation, which is the question of someone who has just shown you something they were not certain was safe to show. The Volcano Manor questline does not offer her a clean ending. The manor's purpose begins to disintegrate. The structures that gave her role meaning fall away, but she is a person who survived her own revelation, who continued after the moment she was most afraid of, and that survival is its own form of resolution even when the world around it has not fully resolved. Goldmask, encountered standing silently at the Altus Plateau Bridge and at other elevated positions across the Lands Between, is the game's most complete portrait of a person so devoted to a question that the question has become indistinguishable from the person. He is a Golden Order fundamentalist, a thinker, not a fighter, who has stripped away everything except the core inquiry of his life, which is the nature of the greater will and the proper form of the order that serves it. He does not speak. He cannot or will not communicate in ordinary language. What he expresses is expressed through his body's orientation, through the positions he takes up in relation to the things he is contemplating, through a language of gesture and stance that only someone patient enough to observe carefully can begin to read. Corin reads him. Corin translates. Without Corin, Goldmask is a cipher, present, intense, meaningful in some way you cannot access. His meditations move him progressively toward a conclusion. He is working out, in the slow and total way of someone for whom thinking is not a casual activity, but a complete vocation, whether the Golden Order can be restored and in what form its restoration would be meaningful. He arrives at conclusions that Corhin relays and that shape the mending rune their questline pursues. The intellectual journey is portrayed as a real journey, spatial, embodied, moving across the lands between in the same way that any other kind of quest moves. What his final conclusion costs him is the game's commentary on the nature of a fully committed inquiry. To follow a question all the way to its end, without flinching at what you find there, without stopping when the answer becomes uncomfortable, this is what Gold Mask does. And it destroys him, because what he finds at the end is not consoling. The Golden Order, as he understands it in its most complete form, requires something the current world cannot provide, and knowing this, he acts on it, and the acting ends him. Gurranq, the beast clergyman who occupies the bestial sanctum in Dragonbarrow, is one of the game's most direct examples of a character whose present state and true identity require time and attention to bring into alignment. He is enormous, feral in his energy, deeply unsettled in a way that communicates something about the cost of maintaining whatever containment he has built around himself. He accepts Deathroot, the corrupted product of Godwyn's spreading deathblight, and consumes it, and in consuming, it receives a kind of satisfaction or release that is enormous. Body visibly responds to. He is, as the game reveals through the completion of his questline and through the encounter with him in the mountaintops of the giants, Malekith, the Black Blade, Marika's. Shadow, the guardian of the Rune of Death, the keeper of the secret that the Golden Order built its power on concealing. The beast clergyman persona is not a complete fiction. Gurranq is a state he enters when the deathroot he has consumed has destabilized him sufficiently that the full knowledge of what he is becomes inaccessible to him. He gives you beast incantations because, in this state, the bestial nature is what is accessible. His hunger for deathroot is not simply gluttony or compulsion. It is, from a certain angle, the expression of an obligation that predates the current shape of the lands between. Malekith was given the Rune of Death to conceal within himself, sealed away from the world, so that death's administration could be controlled by the greater will through Marika. Every piece of deathroot is a corruption of that sealed thing escaping. He eats the corruptions because he cannot let what he is tasked to contain remain loose in the world. When he attacks you at intervals as you bring him deathroot, it is not ingratitude. It is the instability of someone carrying something vast inside themselves, someone for whom the boundaries between the task and the self have been blurred for so long that, responding to the stimulus of what he contains, is simply what happens when the containment strains. Millicent's sisters, Altus, Dorist, Nicola, and Elena, occupy the Halatry with a purpose that is both the same as Millicent's and fundamentally opposed to it. They are, like her, born from millennia's blooming in the Aeonia swamp. They are, like her, daughters of the Rot Goddess in the most literal biological sense available to that term, and they have resolved the question of what to do with that inheritance differently than Millicent did. Where Millicent sought to understand and then to choose, the sisters have accepted. They have embraced the transformation that the rot works in them, the flowering toward the Scarlet Valkyrie state that Gowry intended for Millicent. They are further along the path that Millicent refused, and when they gather at the Halictree to face their sister, they are doing so from the position of those who believe her. Refusal is a loss rather than a choice. The fight against them, which happens when you summon Millicent as an ally and together face the four sisters, is one of the questline's most carefully constructed moments. You are not fighting strangers. You are fighting her family, the only people in the lands between who share her specific origin. And they are not simply attacking out of malice, they are, in their understanding of what is true and what is sacred, trying to return their lost sister to the path they believe she belongs on. That Millicent chooses her own end immediately after this fight, in the shadow of having just defeated the sisters who wanted to bring her back, suggests that the choice was always going to be hers to make, and that making it on her own terms required getting past what they represented first. She fought her way to the moment of her own decision. The needle came out after the sisters were past, not before. E.g., The war counselor, who waits on the Three Sisters plateau in service of Ronnie, is one of the NPCs whose loyalty is given with a fullness that the game does not undermine. He is immense, a troll, the race of stone giants who appear throughout the lands between as workers and warriors and occasionally as beings of surprising interiority. He served Blade's father. He now serves Ronnie. His service is the thread that runs through the succession, the continuity of protection offered from one generation to the next. He worries about Blade. He worries about Ronnie. He carries the counselor's specific burden of advising those he is loyal to while being unable to make their choices for them. When Ranni's plan moves into its most dangerous phase, he can provide information, can provide context, can provide the steadying presence of someone who understands the larger picture. But the choices belong to those he serves, and watching them make those choices from a position of care and concern and incomplete control is the counselor's constant. Condition: his death, if the player allows the questline to proceed to its later stages without intervention, comes from a source connected to the same network of forces that ultimately destroys Blade. He is not safe simply because his loyalty is sincere. The forces that want to control what Ronnie has put in motion are not selective in what they remove. What he leaves behind, the information he shared, the steadying influence he offered in the middle passages of the questline, the specific weight of a being who chose service, and meant it, is part of what makes the completion of Ronnie's quest feel earned. She did not move toward her ending alone. She moved with those who chose to stand with her, and E.G. is among the most quietly essential of those. Dee's brother, encountered in Nokron and given the name Darien in the files, though the game rarely uses it directly, is one of the game's most gentle presences, which is striking given the context in which you find him. He is in Nokron, the eternal city that fell from the sky when Radahn's defeat allowed the stars to move again. He is there in a kind of waiting, occupying a ruin with the patience of someone who has nowhere better to be and no urgency about the fact. He is softer than Dee in every visible quality. Dee's certainty about the undead, about the order that demanded their elimination, is not present in his brother. He carries instead a quality of grief that is not hardened into purpose, the grief of someone who knows what he has lost and has not yet organized that loss into a framework. That makes it manageable. He is, in the specific sense, more human than the hunter his brother became, because the hunter's certainty is its own form of armor, and the brother has not put that armor on. The armor Dee bequeathed to him, or that was taken from Dee and given to him through the Fia questline's strange and indirect logic, fits him poorly, not because it is the wrong size, but because it belongs to a way of being in the world that is not his way. He takes it anyway. He has to do something with what remains. His presence in Nokron is brief in the player's experience of the questline, but long in its implications. He is an example of what Dee might have been if the training, the purpose, the certainty had not been imposed, and seeing him illuminates Dee's character in retrospect, showing what was present before it was organized into the shape the hunter required. Vike, Knight of the Round Table Hold, is encountered as an invader in the game world, rather than as an NPC in the traditional sense, but his story, distributed across item, descriptions, and the environment of Lord Contender's Evergale, where he is held, makes him a kind of absent presence, whose ghost moves through the game. He was, once, a tarnished of enormous promise. He reached the Erd Tree. He came closer than almost any other tarnished to becoming Elden Lord, and then he touched the Frenzied Flame. The Frenzied Flame, encountered in the depths beneath Lindell, is a force of dissolution and heat and the end of all order, the sub-god of chaos that exists in opposition to the greater will's insistence on structure and categorization. To touch it is to be marked by it, consumed by the purpose of spreading its madness, transformed from a seeker of order into an instrument of the flame's will. This is what happened to Vike. He burned his own people. He spread the frenzy. He was stopped, eventually, sealed in the Evergale, but not before leaving a trail of devastation that is the cautionary tale the game attaches to the Frenzied Flame ending. He invades in the area around the Church of Inhibition, where the Frenzied Flame seal is found, a weapon connected to the flame's incantations. His appearance there is not random. He is drawn to the places where the flame's influence concentrates, in the same way that any person whose identity has been reorganized around a single force is drawn to thee, places where that force is most present. His armor, the fingerprint set, tells the story of who he was before the flame and what the flame made of him. He was a knight of real skill and real commitment. He burned his city. Those two facts sit side by side in the item descriptions without the game asking you to reconcile them into a single coherent judgment, because the game understands that the most honest response to a story like Vike's is not to judge, but to carry the knowledge of it forward into the choices that remain. Dialos's companion Lanya, who is dead before the player ever hears her name, is present in the game's world entirely through Dialos's grief. She is not an NPC the player interacts with. She is a structure of absence that shapes everything about the character who loved her. The harm done to her, the attack by bloody fingers that Dialos was unable to prevent, is the engine of his questline, and the fact that the player never meets her is the point. Grief in the lands between is frequently this, structured around an absence that the person who carries it can see clearly in every detail while the world around them sees nothing. Dialos describes Lanya. He tells you what she was, what she meant, what he failed to do. The specificity of his description conjures her more completely than a character model would, because it comes filtered through the love and guilt of someone for whom she is not, past but present. The lands between is full of these absent presences, characters who exist only in the memory of those who survive them, only in item descriptions, only in the geographic, markers left by their passing. Lanya is one of the more human of these, because the person carrying her memory is also among the more human of the game's characters, flawed, warm, performing a version of himself he cannot quite sustain, looking for somewhere to direct a love that no longer has its original object. When Dialos finds his purpose at Jarburg, part of what he finds is a direction for what he could not give Lanya. The protection he extends to the Jar people is not a replacement for what he lost. It is a continuation of the same impulse to be present, to prevent harm, to be the person who showed up when it mattered. He failed that impulse once. He does not stop trying. Latenna the Albinoric, encountered in the Slumbering Wolf Shack in Liurnia, is one of the game's most quietly affecting questlines, because its emotional logic, the logic of a person with a finite amount of time left, trying to ensure that the mission is completed before that time runs out, is so clearly and simply drawn. She has been wounded. She cannot ride on her own. She asks you to carry her to Apostate Derelict in the consecrated snowfield, where she can be reunited with the Albinoric community that remains there. She is cold in manner and direct in communication, not because she is unkind, but because she has organized everything around the task. The task is too important for the kind of warmth that spending time on pleasantries might allow. She is carrying a secret that belongs to the Albinoric people, a secret about the nature of the Halatry medallion and the community at the snowfield, and she is the last person positioned to ensure it reaches those who need it. The Albinoric people, and the lore of the lands between, were created by an ancient sorcerer as a form of human life and subsequently classified by the Golden Order as something lesser, not fully subject to the protections or the dignities afforded to ordinary humans. Their persecution is one of the quietest atrocities in a game full of atrocities. Latenna is among those who survived that persecution, who made it to the Halatry's shade, who is now trying to ensure the community's continued connection to the one person who might protect it. When she is released at Apostate Derelict, when the task is complete and she is reunited with what she was working toward, the stillness that follows is the stillness of a person who has finished what they needed to finish. She does not celebrate. She simply arrives. And arrival, after the length of the journey she has traveled, is enough. Malenia herself, the Blade of Maquella and the Goddess of Rot, is not an NPC in the traditional sense. She is a boss, the game's most notorious one, the figure whose reputation for difficulty extends far beyond the lands between into the cultural conversation around games in general. But her story, distributed across item descriptions and environmental clues, and the quest lines of those who orbited her makes her one of the game's most complete tragic figures. She was born with the scarlet rot inside her. This is her inheritance from the outer god of rot, which found purchase in her through the same divine complexity that gave Miquella his eternal youth. She has fought it her entire life, suppressing it through the force of her will and the skill of her blade, maintaining a discipline that her appearance as an armless warrior with a golden prosthetic communicates in the most direct visual terms available. She has lost much to the rot already. She has refused to lose more. The Aeonia bloom, the moment at the Battle of Caelid, when she released the rot in a flood that scarred the land and stopped Radon in his tracks, was not a victory she sought. It was a failure of containment, the thing she had been preventing her whole life, breaking through the defense she had built against it. And in the breaking, it devastated the landscape and infected Radon with the rot, reducing the magnificent demigod of the stars to a rabid shell hunting the Caelid wastes for. Corpses. She went to the Haligtree afterward, to the refuge that Miquella had built for those excluded by the Golden Order, and she waits there in a kind of stasis, frozen in the moment, between the bloom and whatever comes after it. Her waiting is not peace, it is suspension, the specific state of someone who has not yet found the resolution that would allow the waiting to end. She was sealed in her own cocoon by the rot's progression, and what her questline offers is the encounter with someone who has been held at the edge of their own ending for a very long time. Miquella, the unborn god who reached out through the Haligtree and whose influence over those who love him is the organizing force of the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, is the lands, Between's most carefully absent presence. He is everywhere in the effects he has had on others, and almost nowhere in direct form. He is the center of a network of devotion, Melinia's sacrifice, Mohg's obsession, Ansbach's loyalty, the entire architecture of the realm of shadow, and he is absent from that, center in a way that shapes every person who is moved toward him. He had a dream, and the dream was generous, a place where those excluded by the Golden Order's categories could find refuge. The Haligtree was real. The unalloyed gold needle, which was meant to free people from the influence of outer gods, was real. The care he extended to Millicent and her sisters, though mediated through Gowry's agenda, was real at its origin. He was, in the understanding of those who loved him, someone who could have made a different kind of world. What he became, in the shadow of the Erdtree, is more complicated than the saint his devotees remember. The willful abandonment of his own empathy, the deliberate shedding of the quality that made him Miquella and made his dream worth following in pursuit of the godhood that would make him capable of remaking the world is the central tragedy of the DLC. He chose to become capable of his goal by becoming less of who he was, and the question the deal asks, very quietly, is whether the goal survived the losing of the person who wanted it. In the far reaches of the Altus Plateau, where the golden light of the Erdtree falls across the ruins of a civilization still attempting to maintain the forms of the order it served, there are messages left by people you never meet, items dropped in landscapes that tell the ending of stories the game never began. A letter here, a keepsake there, the impression of a life reduced to a single object that survived when the person did not. This is finally what the lands between is. It is a world of survivors and their relationship to what they survived. Every NPC you encounter is alive, in a world that did not have to leave them alive, and what they do with that continuation, whether they serve or grieve or hunt or question, or simply wait, is the story the game is actually telling, beneath the story of runes and demigods and the mending of a broken ring. Roderica heard the dead and chose to listen. Hugh forged through the darkness of a forgotten commission. Fia held the dying and loved a dead god. Blade howled across the mistwood for company and found it. Nephilim stood in the ruin of who her father taught her to think she was and became something the world required. Millicent chose her own ending rather than someone else's purpose. Alexander moved through his entire journey with the specific grace of someone who has decided that how you face things matters as much as what you face. These are not characters, or rather, they are not only characters, they are the record of what it looks like to carry something: grief, purpose, faith, doubt, love, obligation, devotion, through a world that makes carrying very difficult. And tonight, sitting by this fire, letting the amber light hold the quiet, there is something in that record worth honoring. The Lands Between does not promise resolution, it promises continuation. The grace burns. The road extends forward into dark that the next sight of grace will eventually illuminate. What moves through that dark is not certainty, it is the willingness to keep going, which is its own form of grace, and which every person in this world, player and NPC and demigod and wandering spirit alike, is in some way practicing. The finger maidens who serve the two fingers, Melina and those like her, women shaped by the greater will's administration of the world to serve as guides and vessels for those it has chosen, occupy a position the game illuminates gradually, through small disclosures rather than direct explanation. Melina, who first appears in the stranded graveyard and offers you the ability to level by burning her own essence at sites of grace, presents herself as someone who wants to take you to the Erd Tree. She does not initially explain why she is oriented toward this goal. She simply offers the alliance and waits for you to accept. She is different from the other finger maidens in one respect that she mentions, and the game never fully resolves: she has no finger. She was not assigned to a tarnished champion in the ordinary way. She found you in the graveyard without that formal assignment, guided by something she describes as a purpose she holds but does not fully understand. The maidens who serve in the ordinary way are reflections of the two fingers, intermediaries, conduits, instruments of the greater will's orientation of its chosen. Melina is something else, and what she is something else of is connected to Marika in a way that the game surfaces and then leaves open. Her agreement to be your maiden comes with a cost she knows about and does not hide. She will burn. She is the kindling for the Erd Tree. She carries within her the flame that the tree requires to be opened, and she has accepted this fact with the equanimity of someone who has known for a long time that this is how things end for her. She is, in the specific sense, moving through the entire journey of the game toward her own death, which she has agreed to as the condition of helping you reach yours, the end. That will change things for everyone. What she feels about this, and the complex way that a character with genuine interiority feels things, is distributed across small moments. The wonder she expresses at lands she has never seen, the genuine interest she takes in the world they travel through together, the specific pleasure of someone who is alive and moving and paying attention and has not wasted the time left to them on anything less than full presence. She is finite, and she knows it, and she inhabits the finite time with a fullness that is its own form of instruction. The Eclipse Shotel and the weapons of the Knight's Cavalry, spectral soldiers who patrol the roads of the Lands Between in the dark hours and vanish with the dawn, belong to a category of lore that the game deposits in item descriptions for those who slow down enough to read them. The Knight's Cavalry were, before the Shattering, an order of soldiers who served the greater will's administration of death in the world. They escorted souls. They maintained the passage between the living and the Erd Tree that the Golden Order depended on. When the Elden Ring broke and the Golden Order collapsed, they were caught between functions, still riding, still patrolling, still performing the form of the duty that had given them shape, even though the purpose that form was meant to serve no longer coherently existed. They are, in the deepest sense, soldiers whose war ended without their knowledge. They continue to move through the night roads of the Lands Between, and the specific persistence of those who have not received the notification that things have changed. Their armor glows faintly with the light of a grace that persists past the dissolution of the order it was meant to serve. They are the afterimage of a structure that the Shattering dissolved, still holding the shape of the dissolved thing, still occupying the roads as if the roads still needed what they once provided. This is one of the lore images the game returns to, in different forms throughout its world, the shape of a purpose persisting past the dissolution of the purpose's context. The Crucible Knights, who bear the mark of a primordial life that the Golden Order tried to categorize and contain. The Cleanrot Knights, who still serve Melania and the Halatry despite the Battle of Ionia being a ruin. The Tree Sentinels, who guard gates that no longer protect what they were built to protect. The Lands Between is a landscape of maintained forms and dissolved contents, of soldiers and servants and guards and merchants, all doing what they were made to do in a world that has stopped requiring it. And yet there is something in the maintenance, in the choosing to continue, that the game finds worth examining. The Knight's Cavalry does not know that things have changed, which is different from knowing and continuing anyway. But the image they cut across the moonlit roads of the Lands Between is striking, dark-armored, horse-mounted, moving with the precision of those who have not lost faith because they have not understood that faith was ever in question. The Volcano Manor, before it was an assassin's guild, and before Rykard made his blasphemous compact with the Serpent God, was a place of genuine hospitality. This is suggested in fragments, in the way Tanith speaks of it, in the remnants of the manor's aesthetic that sit underneath the violence and the architecture of a building, designed for gathering rather than for killing. It was a place where those who had been excluded from the Golden Order's grace might find temporary shelter, a pause in the exile, a moment of warmth in a world organized around their exclusion. Rykard's turn toward the Serpent God, his feeding of himself to the ancient deity that dwells beneath the volcano, his merger with it into something that calls itself the Lord of Blasphemy, was, in the terms of his own internal logic, an attempt to make himself powerful enough to end the Greater Will's dominion over the Lands Between. He had seen what the Golden Order did to those it judged unworthy. He had watched his fellow demigods struggle with the demands of a system designed to use them as instruments. He decided that the only response to a power you cannot match in its own terms is to become something it cannot classify. The Serpent God that consumed him is older than the Golden Order. It belongs to a category of power that the Golden Order's architecture was built around managing or suppressing, not confronting directly. By becoming it, or becoming part of it, Rykard stepped outside the ledger in which the Greater Will maintained its accounting of the world. He cannot be absorbed by the Erdtree because the Erdtree has no category for what he became. His desire, expressed through the serpent's vast body and his own voice still audible within it, is to devour the gods, to consume the divine in the literal manner of a god. Eating serpent, to do to the cosmological powers what they have done to the people of the Lands Between. This is a project the game treats neither as obviously right nor as obviously monstrous. It is the response of a person who decided that the system could not be reformed from inside it, and that something more fundamental was required. The Cleanrot Knights, who serve in the Halatry, tall, precise, armored in gold and white, and carrying the weapons of Millennia's elite guard, are among the game's most visually coherent enemies in terms of what their appearance communicates about the force they serve. They are clean in a world organized around rot. They are golden in a world where gold belongs to the Erdtree, and Melania is the Erdtree's abandoned child. They are, in their bearing and their precision, a statement about what Melania cultivated in those who chose to serve her, an excellence that did not require the Golden Order's endorsement. They follow her to the Halictree in the wake of the Ionia bloom. They remain in the ruins of her isolation, maintaining the forms of their service and the absence of any battlefield that requires it, guarding a goddess who is cocooned in thee. Rot she spent her life fighting. There is something in their continued presence that speaks to the nature of deep loyalty, the kind that persists through failure and beyond active purpose, that does not require ongoing instruction or ongoing victory to remain intact. The rot that corrupts some of them, the scarlet versions that appear deeper in the Halictree, is not a fall but a furthering. They have been touched by what they protect. The goddess they serve is the goddess of rot, and to be near her long enough is to carry some of what she carries. They did not abandon their posts when the rot reached them. They simply continued to guard from within the condition of what they were guarding. This is the shape of devotion at its most extreme expression in the lands between. Continued presence in the face of transformation, continued service in the absence of the capacity to fully understand what the service is now for. The clean rot knights are the image of loyalty, past the point where loyalty can be anything but its own reason. Smithing Master E.G., the troll who serves on the Three Sisters Plateau, and the relationship between his enormous physical form and his careful counseling nature is one of the game's quietest character gestures. He is immense, a giant stone being, the kind of figure that in other contexts might signal threat or obstacle, and he is gentle, not gentle in the way of something that has suppressed its force, but gentle in the way of something that shows its orientation deliberately and has maintained it across a span of time long enough that it is now simply who he is. His role in the Three Sisters questline is to provide what a counselor provides: information, orientation, the perspective of someone who has been close enough to the situation, for long enough to understand its history without being so close that they have lost objectivity about it. He tells you about Blade. He tells you, carefully, what Blade is to Ranni and what that might mean as things move forward. He does not tell you more than you need, and he does not tell you less than you do. The troll people of the lands between are used, largely, as laborers, stonecutters, workers, bearers of heavy things. The assumption in the world's social architecture is that their enormous size and evident physical capacity is what they are for. E.g. is the complication of that assumption, a being of enormous size who has been given a role that requires the mind, not the body, and who has grown into that role with the fullness of someone for whom it fits better than any alternative would. He worries about those he serves with a depth that his careful manner does not fully conceal. The worry is real, and the care is real, and the limitation of what a counselor can do, which is to advise, not to choose, to inform, not to decide, is what he lives within as. The questline moves toward its conclusions. He is present at the edges of decisions he cannot make, offering what light he can into the dark that the decisions are made in. The Albinoric shepherd, who waits in the village of the Albinorics in Liurnia, leading a flock of sheep above the poisonous waters that have submerged the lower portions of the village, carries in his pastoral image one of the game's more pointed ironies. He tends his flock in a community that has been largely destroyed, maintaining the forms of ordinary life, shepherd, sheep, the simple rhythm of care and movement above the ruin of the world that ordinary life depended on. He is, according to the community's structure, carrying one half of the Haligtree medallion, the secret passage that allows the player to reach the consecrated snowfield and, eventually, the Haligtree itself. He does not explain this. He simply sits with his flock in the village that violence and contamination have reduced to a remnant, continuing the work that a shepherd does in a landscape that no longer looks like a place where shepherds are required. The Albinoric people's persecution, their classification by the Golden Order as something less than human, the violence done to them in their communities across the lands between, is not foregrounded in any single dramatic sequence. It accumulates. It is present in the destroyed villages and the scattered survivors and the specific grief that Latenna carries toward the people at the snowfield who made it there. It is present in the shepherd and his flock, tending a community that exists mostly as the memory of a community now. What the image of the shepherd above the poisoned water says, if you stop and read it, is something about what persists when everything else has been taken: the care for living things, the rhythm of tending, the simple maintenance of what remains to be maintained. He does not know when help will come. He tends his flock. This is the quiet heroism of those the game places at the margins, not dramatic, not celebrated, but present. Sorcerer Thops, encountered in the Church of Erith in Liurnia, and later within the Academy of Raya Lucaria after you give him a glintstone key, is a small figure who's small. Story contains something about the specific cost of intellectual aspiration in a world organized around keeping knowledge within its proper channels. He was an academy student. He was suspended or expelled, or simply found himself on the outside of the institution's doors through a circumstance the game handles briefly, and he has been teaching simple sorceries to anyone who will pay in Liurnia ever since. He wants to go back, not out of ambition, not out of a desire for power or prestige, but because the academy is where the books are, and the books are where the questions that interest him most are being addressed, and he is outside the doors, and the questions are continuing without him. He is, very simply, a person who loves learning and has been separated from the place where his kind of learning happens, and who spends his days in a minor church in a minor part of the world trying to remember what it felt like to be on the inside. When you give him the Academy Glintstone key and he goes back, his fate is handled with a gentleness of understatement. You find him inside, at a desk still and small, having died doing what he went back to do, studying. He was not killed in a dramatic confrontation. He simply went back to the academy and continued reading until he could not anymore, and the academy closed around him in the specific way that systems close around those who return to them without full right of return. His bell bearing, when you find it, allows you to purchase his items. It is, in the game's idiom, a form of continuation. Something of him persists in the trade. Something of the sorceries he taught passes forward. He does not get a heroic ending. He gets an ending that looks like his life, small, scholarly, oriented toward knowledge, and overtaken by the world before the knowledge was finished. Liurnian gravekeeper, Arena, seated at a roadside beside her dead horse and her lost letter, is present in the game for a very short time and leaves a mark disproportionate to the duration of her presence. She is blind. She is stranded. She has a letter she cannot carry to her father Edgar at Castle Morn, and she asks you, with the simple directness of someone who has no other option, whether you might take it there for her. The quest line that follows is brief and devastating. Edgar is at Castle Morn because he is maintaining a siege against the misbegotten, the lion-faced people who have revolted against the servitude the Golden Order imposed on them, even as the Miranda flowers have overrun the outer regions and the castle is falling. He refuses to leave until the grafted blade greatsword is secured, because it is a legacy that belongs to his family and his daughter, and securing it is the last clear obligation he has. When you return to Irina, she is dead. Edgar, arriving late, finds her there. What happens to him after this, the hollowing grief, the transformation into the revenant festering fingerprint Vike, the invasion, is the direct expression of a father who had one obligation he refused to compromise on and arrived too late to save the person he was preserving the obligation for. The tragedy of Irina and Edgar is not about heroism or its absence. It is about timing and the specific cruelty of a world in which getting there matters as much as going. He did the right thing, in his own terms. He came. He was not in time. The gap between doing what you believe is right and the moment in which it could have mattered is one of the Lands Between's most persistent images of grief. Remembrances are the game's record of the great, the compacted memory of a demigod's power, left behind when that demigod is defeated, available to the player either as an exchange for their weapons and skills, or as a window into who they were. What the remembrances communicate, in aggregate, is that every figure the player faces as a boss was once a person moving through the world with something that mattered to them. Godric the Grafted was the weakest of the demigods, the last of the lineage, the one who dealt with his inadequacy by grafting the limbs of defeated warriors onto his own body, until he became a tower of borrowed strength that concealed a genuine fear at its center. His remembrance speaks to a lineage pride so fierce it curdled into the specific violence of someone who needs to be seen as great more than they need to be great. Radon, the Star Scourge, held the stars in place through his gravity magic so that Ranni's constellation-based fate could not proceed, which means that the enormous general who fought the entire academy of Raya Lucaria to a standstill was, in the cosmological sense, one of the most consequential people in the history of the lands between, maintaining a celestial equilibrium through sheer magical force in a way that shaped the fate of every person in the world. His remembrance is the record of that enormous capacity deployed in the specific way of someone who chose horses over ceremony and never learned to think of himself as anything other than a soldier. Morgoth the Omen King, who warned you from the game's first arrival at Lindell's outer wall, who called you maidenless and meant it, who fought to protect the city even in its most compromised state from the tarnished he could not stop. His remembrance speaks to someone who hated what he was and served what he hated in the name of something larger. He is an omen, cursed at birth, horned and marked and excluded from the Golden Order's grace, who spent his life defending that same order. The shape of his devotion is the shape of a person who has decided that belonging to a thing matters more than how the thing treats you. The great runes themselves, the shards of the Elden Ring, distributed among the demigods after the shattering, are not simply sources of power. They are, in the lore's terms, the condensed aspects of the Elden Ring's original nature, pieces of the cosmic law that governed the lands between before the breaking. What each demigod carries is not a weapon or a treasure, but a fragment of a set of rules about how existence is supposed to work. Godric's great rune, which strengthens all attributes, is the rune of the whole, the part of the original Elden Ring concerned with the completeness of a being, their total capacity. That it fell to Godric, who compensated for his personal incompleteness with borrowed parts, is one of the game's quietest ironies. Radon's great rune, which raises maximum attributes to extreme heights, is the rune of excess, the part of the Elden Ring associated with the expansion of the possible, with pushing the known limits outward. It belongs to the demigod, who is always described in terms of scale, the strongest demigod, the one who fought the Academy to a standstill, the one whose gravity magic held thee. Stars in place, the rune found its person, or the person grew into their rune. Morgoth's great rune, which grants enormous amounts of maximum health, is the rune of endurance, the part of the original law concerned with persistence, with the capacity to remain. That it fell to the Omen King, who persisted in service of an order that despised him, is again the kind of alignment the game makes quietly, rather than announcing. The Elden Ring, before the shattering, was all of these things at once: completeness, excess, endurance, grace, wisdom, order, and the others. What the shattering made of it was a set of fragments, each held by someone who embodied one aspect while lacking the others, each fragment constituting an argument for a particular way of organizing the world without the counterbalancing arguments that the ring's wholeness provided. The Crucible, which the game references as the primordial state of life in the lands between, before the Greater Will's order imposed its categories, is visible most directly in the Crucible Knights, enemies who bear organic extensions on their armor, growths of horn and feather and tail that reflect the old multiplicity of the pre-order world. But it is also visible in the game's lore in almost everything the Golden Order persecutes. The Omen, those born with horns, the marks of the Crucible, asserting itself in the lineage of even the divine, are the most explicit example. Morgoth and Mao, both children of Marika and Godfrey, were born with horns and were therefore classified by the Golden Order as cursed. They were imprisoned beneath Lindell's sewers. The firstborn children of the first Elden Lord and his divine queen were hidden because their existence contradicted the Order's insistence on clean categories. The Crucible's mark appears in Melinia's rot, in the demi-humans of the coast and caves, in the existence of the omens and the albinorics and the misbegotten, in every form of life that the Golden Order decided was not acceptable. What the game suggests, quietly and consistently, is that these forms are not aberrations. They are expressions of the primordial multiplicity that existed before the Order sorted everything into its sanctioned shapes. Godwyn spreading through the roots and the stone, the death blight that killed Rogier, and that Fia sought in the deep root depths, is perhaps the most extreme expression of The crucible's principle, life refusing to stay in the category it was placed in, extending itself beyond the boundary between the living and the dead into something new and uncategorized. The Golden Order cannot absorb this. The Erd Tree cannot absorb Godwin as he now is. He is beyond the ledger. This is the deepest argument the game makes about the world it has built, that the categories imposed by power are always insufficient to the actual multiplicity of what exists, and that what is excluded from those categories does not disappear. It continues transformed in the spaces the categories cannot reach. The lands between sleeps now, in the way that a world sleeps, not entirely still, but breathing slowly, the fires at each site of grace burning low and patient, the roads empty, of the tarnished who walked them, and full of the history they uncovered in walking. Every NPC still waits in their appointed place, still carrying what they carry, still oriented toward the purpose, or the grief, or the loyalty that defines them. Roderica still sits near the fire, listening to the quiet voices of those the world left behind. Hugh still works at his forge, following the dream whose dreamer he does not remember. Fia still holds those who come to her, offering the warmth of a death-touched embrace to those who need it. Nephili still governs from the throne of Stormvale, her father's daughter in ways she is still discovering. Alexander's memory persists in the ashes that carry his spirit forward into each new battle. Millicent rests beside her chosen pool, having arrived at her own ending on her own terms. And Ranni moves, somewhere in the dark beyond the Erd Tree, having carried her enormous plan to its completion, and stepped out into the freedom that completing it required. The distance of a new moon from a world that needed the room she gave it by leaving. These are the people of the lands between, not the demigods, and not the gods, not the cosmic forces that shaped the world's structure, but the specific and particular and individual people who lived in the world that structure made the hunters and the scholars and the wanderers and the faithful and the doubtful and the devoted and the broken and the quietly whole. Their stories do not end when the credits roll. They exist in the permanence of having happened, in the memory of those who spent time with them, who sat with them at their fires, who listened to what they had to say before, moving on into the dark toward the next grace and the next obligation. The Lands Between is finally a record of how people carry things through a world that makes carrying very difficult. There is a figure in the Round Table Hold who says very little, but whose silence carries weight. Hugi has already been mentioned, and Roderica and Enia, but there is also the presence of the two fingers themselves, communicating through Enia's reading to those who will. Listen. The fingers are not NPCs in any conversational sense. They are communication channels, the physical form through which a cosmic will reaches into the immediate world. But what they communicate, read carefully through Enia's translations, is the shape of a plan that has been in motion far longer than the shattering. The two fingers of the Round Table Hold are not the only two fingers in the Lands Between. Each major region had its own pair, its own finger reader, its own local conduit for the greater will's administration of the world. What the shattering did to these networks of communication is one of the quieter catastrophes of the lore. The channels fell silent, or fell into confusion, or began transmitting things that no longer clearly connected to the source they were supposed to represent. The three fingers, by contrast, are singular and far older. They predate the two fingers' arrival in the Lands Between by an enormous margin. They are the fingers of an older god, not the greater will, but the force that opposes it, the chaos that existed before order, and that waits with enormous patience for order. To exhaust itself. The frenzied flame they tend is not a tool of destruction in the simple sense. It is, in the theology of those who follow it, the kindness of dissolution, the ending of all the suffering that categorical existence produces. The people who find their way to the three fingers, Hyetta, Vike before his fall, and potentially the tarnished themselves, are people for whom the conventional consolations of the world have failed. They are people who have found the edges of what the ordered world offers and discovered that the edges are not gentle. The warmth they seek in the flame is real in its way. It is just not the warmth that can be survived. Seluvis, the sorcerer who maintains a tower near Rani's rise in the Three Sisters and presents himself as one of Rani's trusted associates, is one of the game's most carefully constructed portraits of a person who uses the language of service to execute entirely self-interested ends. He speaks of Rani with the tone of loyalty while running in the hidden chamber beneath his tower, an operation that is entirely his own and that she does not know about. He creates puppets. Not in the metaphorical sense, but in the literal, he has developed a sorceress technique for reducing people to marionette-like forms that serve his will completely. The puppet making is done through a potion that he asks you, early in his questline, to give to Nephili Lu, framed as medicine, presented as help, intended to reduce her to one more figure in his collection. Whether you give her the potion and who you give it to if you do not give it to her determines one thread of the questline's shape. But the most revealing aspect of Seluvis is not the puppets themselves. It is the attempt to make one of Rani. He is trying to reduce the witch he ostensibly serves to the same state of total compliance that his other puppets occupy. His loyalty is not loyalty at all. It is a form of desired possession wearing the mask of service. His fate, when discovered, is handled with the specific contempt the game reserves for those who mistake cleverness for wisdom. He is not a tragic figure. He is a cautionary one, a person who reduced everyone around them to instruments and was ultimately consumed by the consequences of that reduction. The sorceries he taught and the puppets he collected outlast him in a form that the game allows to persist without fully endorsing. Preceptor Seluvis aside, the Towers of the Three Sisters are among the game's most layered environments, architectural relics of the Carian royal family's relationship to the stars and to the sorceries those stars governed. The Carian tradition, distinct from the Academy of Raya Lucaria's glintstone practice, works with the stars themselves as sources rather than intermediaries. Where Academy sorcery harvests the ambient power of glintstone, the crystallized residue of starlight and cosmic force, Carian sorcery reaches further back to the source. This distinction explains the aesthetic difference between the two traditions and the political difference as well. The Academy's relationship to the Carian royals has been one of periodic tension. The Carians predated the Academy and its methods in the Liurnia region, and the Academy's more systematic institutional approach to sorcery was in some ways built over and around a tradition that the Carians embodied personally rather than through organization. Rinola, who became the Academy's Grand Master and who was encountered broken in the Grand Library's ruin, represents the point at which the personal and the institutional merged, and then catastrophically separated. She brought the Carian tradition into the Academy's structure. Her marriage to Radagon was, among other things, the yoking of two enormous sorceress lineages into a single family. When Radagon left to become Marika's consort, when he was summoned to a role that superseded everything else, what broke in Rinola was not simply a marriage, but the entire architecture of a life built around a center that relocated without asking her. She retreats into her own mind, surrounded by the students who cannot bring themselves to leave, spending her days in an amber egg of reconstructed memory, rebuilding the life she had in the forms available to her. She is not mad in the clinical sense. She is refusing the present in favor of a past that was better, which is a choice the human mind makes under certain kinds of loss, and which the game presents without judgment. Edgar, Irina's father, and the Knight of Castle Morn, has already been mentioned in Irina's section, but the detail of what he becomes after her death deserves its own space. He transforms in the specific and literal way that grief transforms people in the lands between into something called a festering bloody fingerprint invader. He invades in Liurnia, in the area around the Church of Inhibition, carrying his grief as a weapon against the world. The inversion of his original character, the devoted father who maintained his post out of obligation to his daughter and his family legacy, into a figure of invasion and violence is the game's sharpest expression of what uncomplicated love, broken, can become. He is not evil. He is deranged by loss. The distinction matters because the game's world insists on making it. There are people in the lands between who do terrible things because they are terrible, and there are people who do terrible things because something terrible was done to them first, and the game does not simplify the difference, even when the practical result looks similar. What he carries as an invader is the festering bloody finger, the tool of invasion, the mark of the formless mother's influence, the thing that Yura and eventually the Tarnished worked to suppress across the world. He took up the invasion not because he was recruited by Moog or drawn to the formless mother's theology, but because invasion was what remained available to him when the structure of his life collapsed. He invades because movement is better than stillness, and violence is better than the kind of quiet that grief insists on. The bell bearings that can be found throughout the lands between, dropped by merchants and craftspeople and scholars when they die, or purchased as the last expression of a character's existence in the world, are one of the game's most quietly meaningful mechanical systems. They allow the player to purchase what a dead NPC once sold at the Round Table Hold's twin maiden husks. The twin maidens receive them and extend the dead's inventory forward into the living world. This is, in the lore's terms, a form of afterlife. The merchant who sold you bolts in Limgrave has a bell bearing. When he dies, when the world takes him the way the world takes everyone eventually, his knowledge of supply and demand, his inventory of goods, his function in the economy of the lands between, passes to the husks at the hold and continues. He is gone. His goods remain available. The twin maiden husks themselves are among the hold's most uncanny presences. They are two women merged into a single figure, wearing the husk armor, maintaining the hold's supply function with the efficiency of those for whom the commercial relationship between the living and the dead has become entirely naturalized. They do not explain themselves. They accept the bell bearings. They extend the dead's inventory. The economy continues. There is something in this system, in the game's decision to make the death of merchants not a simple loss, but a transfer, a continuation that speaks to the larger relationship the lands between maintains with the dead. Nothing is simply gone. Everything that was leaves something behind that can be held and used and passed forward. This is the principle of the Erd Tree, applied to the small commercial transactions of adventurers buying arrows and bolts and smithing stones. Dialos at Jarburg, once he arrives there and begins the process of becoming the protector the small jar community needs, undergoes a transformation that the game handles with characteristic quietness. He does not announce the transformation. He simply changes between the player's visits in ways that the specific details of each conversation accumulate. He is less performance. He is more present. He is found in the simple and concrete task of protecting small beings who cannot protect themselves, something the manor's grandiose language of blasphemy and the holds. Complex political dynamics could not give him. The Jar people's acceptance of him is not conditional on who he was, or what family he came from, or what failures preceded his arrival among them. They needed someone to be there, and he was there. And the transaction between a vulnerable community and a person with a specific capacity to help is one of the game's most uncomplicated examples of how purpose finds people when people stop insisting on the form it should take. His ending, which arrives in a late visit after significant time has passed in the game's progression, is consistent with the life he found at Jarburg. He has given what he had to give. He has protected what he came to protect. He is at rest. The game does not frame this as tragedy, which is notable. Deaths in the lands between are frequently tragedies of one kind or another, of waste or violence or isolation. Dialos's ending feels, within the terms the game establishes, like something close to completion. He found his thing. He did it. He rested. Jar Bairn survives, and the Jarburg continues, and what Dialos left behind persists in the protection he provided long enough for the community to find its footing again. This is the form of legacy available to someone without armies or great powers, the specific improvement in the conditions of the specific people you chose to stand next to. Goldmask, contemplating his final problem at the very peak of the mountaintop of the giant's altitude, in the cold and rarefied air of the game's late regions, is at a point of inquiry that few people survive arriving at. He is examining the nature of the Golden Order so completely, so without the protective padding of ordinary belief, that the examination has brought him to the edge of what can be known. He can see the architecture of the thing he has devoted his life to from the outside now, in a way that those who simply live within it cannot. What he sees is not encouraging. The Golden Order, in its current form, the form in which it failed catastrophically and produced the shattering and everything that followed, was not simply imperfectly implemented. It was structured around an absence, a dependency on the greater will's direct presence that the will's remoteness made unreliable. Mending the Elden Ring in the old form would reproduce the old dependency. The restoration that Goldmask and Corrin are working toward requires something different. His conclusion, when it arrives, requires the greater will's direct intervention, the kind of cosmic presence that the greater will, in its current relationship to the lands between, does not provide. He has worked out that the thing he wants cannot be had with the resources available, and so he acts on his conclusion in the only way available to him, which is to make his belief literal in a form that the world cannot ignore. His burning is not despair. It is the last argument of a philosopher who has run out of theoretical room. Corrin, who loved him and followed him and interpreted his silence to the world, is left with the absence of the center his life had organized itself around. This is the most intimate grief available to the faithful, not the destruction of a system, but the death of the person through whom the system was apprehensible. The demi-human communities, the small ape-like beings encountered in caves and ruins throughout the early lands between, occupy the game's world as evidence of the Golden Order's categorical failures made literal. They are, in the lore's terms, former humans or proto-humans who were placed outside the Order's ledger of acceptable existence, whose connection to the grace cycle was severed, or never established, who live therefore in the margins with what they have. Their communities have hierarchies, leaders, shamans. They have something that could be called culture in the specific sense of shared practices and shared memory. They worship in their own way, make their own weapons, maintain their own social structures in the caves and cliff faces where they have been pushed by the expansion of the Order's settlements. They are not animals. They are people the world decided not to count as people. The violence they do, the raids, the attacks on travelers, is the violence of communities under pressure, communities that have been in a defensive posture so long that it has become the default posture, communities for whom the tarnished walking through their territory is simply the latest in a long series of presences that did not wish them well. This does not excuse the violence in any simple sense, and the game does not ask you to excuse it, but it asks you to see it in context, to understand that the creature in front of you is the product of a world that had very specific ideas about which lives deserved resources, and which were expendable. The misbegotten, the lion-faced beings who appear in Castle Morn and elsewhere, who revolt against the servitude imposed on them, are a more organized expression of the same exclusion. They were created as servants and decided they did not wish to remain servants and acted on that decision with the force available to them. The game allows this revolt to be legible as revolt rather than simple monster aggression, which is part of what makes the world of the lands between feel inhabited rather than merely populated. The Lake of Rot, in the deepest reaches of Ainsel River beneath the lands between surface, is the closest the game comes to the presence of the outer god of Rot in a physical and navigable form. It is not Melania. It is not the Ionia Swamp. It is the concentrated deposit of the Rot's principle, the accumulation of the god of Scarlet Rot's will in a space that exists outside the ordinary geography, in the underground that even the lands between surface world does not fully acknowledge. To cross the Lake of Rot is to make a decision about what you can endure. The rot builds, the damage accumulates. The crossing requires resources and planning, and the acceptance that the world through which you are moving does not care about your survival. It does not hate you. It simply is what it is, concentrated and indifferent, and you are in it. The architecture at the lake's edges, the ruins, the ancient structures that predate the current surface world, suggests a civilization that existed before the Golden Orders. Ordering of the lands between, before the categories that made the rot illegible were imposed. Whatever lived near the Lake of Rot in those earlier times had a different relationship to the scarlet disease than the people of the current world do. Whether that relationship was symbiotic or worshipful, or simply accepting in the way that people living near volcanoes accept that heat is a feature of the landscape, the game. Leaves open. The valiant gargoyles who guard the lake's deepest reaches, paired, each incomplete without the other, the two together forming a single guardian that is larger than either. Alone are relics of something. What they guarded before the tarnished came to cross the lake they still guard. The commission persists. The grantor of the commission is gone. The lands between is full of this, loyal things operating past the context that created their loyalty. Blade's howl, that first sound in Mistwood that begins his introduction to the player, is worth returning to. It is a call for company, not a hunting cry, not a warning. A call, the sound of a creature with the instincts of a predator and the loneliness of a person, choosing the human need over the animal signal, reaching outward into the dark, for something that can hear and respond. He is, among the Lands Between's characters, the one who makes most visible the cost of being formed for a specific purpose. He was made to be Ranni's shadow. This is not a role he arrived at through choice or circumstance. It is what he is, the way a key is what it is, the way a door is what it is. His devotion to Ranni is not chosen loyalty. It is structural. And yet within that structure, he has developed something that looks very much like genuine attachment, genuine personality, genuine preference for the company of interesting people over the company of none. The tragedy of what happens to him is not that his devotion was wrong. It is that the world he was devoted to did not have a safe place for what he was. A witch's shadow is a being outside the category of acceptable things. When the witch moves beyond the reach of the forces that want to control her, the shadow becomes untethered in the specific way of something whose organizing principle has. Relocated beyond the available distance, he deserved better. This is a thing you can say about very few characters in the Lands Between, not because the others are undeserving, but because the game rarely wants you to make such a clear claim. But with Blade, the game sets up everything that would have been required for a different ending, shows you exactly what would have been needed, and then removes it from reach. He deserved better. The world did not provide it. The fire at each site of grace burns with a quality of light that the game's design team described in interviews as the warmth of something that chose to remain. The sites of grace are not simply respawn points or mechanical conveniences, though they are those things too. They are, in the lore, places where the grace of the Erd Tree pools and concentrates, where the dead can return and the living can rest. The golden light they emit is the same light that emanates from the Erd Tree itself, the life force of accumulated souls, expressed outward as warmth. To rest at a site of grace is, in the lore's terms, to briefly touch the accumulated life of everyone who died and return to the tree. The warmth you feel is the warmth of all of them together, the soldiers and the merchants and the pilgrims and the children, and the old people who died in the ordinary ways of ordinary lives before the shattering, who returned to the tree and became part of its light. It is, for all the violence that surrounds it, a genuinely comforting thought. Elden Ring's world communicates history through architecture in a way that rewards those who slow down and look carefully at what is standing and what is not. The Altus Plateau, where the game's middle acts are set, is a landscape in the process of losing its form, the capital of Lindell visible at its center, surrounded by the ruins of the civilization that grew up in the Erd Tree's light and then watched the light destabilize. The manors that sit along the Altus roads are not abandoned because their inhabitants fled. They are abandoned because their inhabitants became something else. The Omen who haunt the sewers beneath Lindell are a population removed and contained, born into a ruling family's bloodline, carrying the marks of the Crucible, imprisoned beneath the civilization that produced them. But the civilization above goes on without them, performing the forms of the Golden Order's grace as if the sewers beneath do not exist, as if the exclusion that powers thee. Civilization's moral clarity is not a choice made by people who preferred not to examine it. This is one of the Lands Between's persistent structural observations that the ordered world above the surface is built on what was pushed beneath it. The Seofer River, the Ainsel River, the deep-root depths, the underground regions of the game are not simply additional geography. They are the history that the surface world refuses to look at directly, the accumulated consequence of the decisions that the Golden Order required and that the people who benefited from the Order preferred not to remember. The roots of the Erd Tree, which reach into the deep-root depths and connect to the stone through which Godwin's deathblight spreads, are both the tree's foundation and its exposure. They show what the tree is built on, the compacted life of everything that ever died and returned to it, the literal bodies of the accumulated past still present in root form. Beneath the golden canopy of the present, the Lands Between sits on its own dead. This is not unique to the Lands Between, it is simply more visible there. The Round Table Hold, which appears as a place outside the ordinary geography of the world, accessible through grace rather than through physical travel, existing in its own pocket of sustained safety, is one of the more carefully considered spaces in the game's design. It is not neutral. It has an agenda. The agenda is the agenda of the two fingers in the greater will, to gather tarnished, to focus them on the Elden Lord quest, to provide the minimum support necessary to maintain their orientation toward the Erd Tree. The people who accumulate there are not random. They are people with specific functions. The blacksmith who forges the weapons, the spirit tuner who strengthens the summons, the finger reader who translates the two fingers, the all-knowing who provides information, the warrior who will eventually take the throne of Stormvale. Each of them serves a function in the overall project of producing an Elden Lord. The Hold is, in its way, a factory. What makes it feel like more than a factory is the incidental life that accumulates in its corners. The conversations between characters who were not designed to interact. The small moments of connection that develop between Roderica and Hugh. The specific way that Ennia's age sits in contrast to the younger Tarnished who passed through. The presence of Insha in his corner, whose silence makes everyone else's activity more legible by contrast. A space designed for a function becomes a place when the people inside it start to make it theirs. The Round Table Hold becomes a place, despite its origin as a cosmic management tool, because the people in it are people. They have their own relationships to what they are doing there, their own histories that predate the Hold's purpose, their own ways of being that the Hold's agenda cannot fully organize. Roderica did not come to the Hold to become a spirit tuner. She came to the Hold because you told her to, and she became a spirit tuner because that is who she turned out to be. This is perhaps the most consistent thing the game says about its world, that the people in it are always more than the functions they were given. The function may be the door through which they enter, but who they are, once they are through it, is their own. The Caria Manor's history before Renala's marriage to Radagon is a history of sorceress sovereignty. The Carian royal family governed the Liurnia region through a tradition of lunar magic and starfall sorcery that predated both the Academy and the Golden Order's expansion into the northwest of the Lands Between. The three towers of the three sisters, Ranni's Rise, Renna's Rise, Renala's Rise, are the remnants of the three daughters' individual presences in this tradition. Renala was Renala's eldest, who entered the river and became part of it, a transformation that the game presents obliquely, through item descriptions and the presence of the glintstone dragon Smaragd in the nearby lake, suggesting a merger between the eldest daughter and some form of the water's ancient magic. Renna's Rise is sealed, locked behind a wind that the player eventually learns to command through a summons, the Tower of the Middle Sister, inaccessible and reserved. maintained in its sealed state as if the privacy of whoever once inhabited it is still worth protecting. Ranni's rise is the most accessible and the most inhabited because Ranni is the most present, the one who chose engagement over withdrawal, who decided that the inheritance. She received required active response rather than the quieter transformations her sisters underwent. She came back to the three sisters after her two deaths, the death of her flesh, which she arranged deliberately to sever the greater will's hold on her, and the partial death of her godhood, and built her plan from the structure that the family's towers still provided. The Carrion Manor below the towers is her grandmother's domain, or was. Renala's mother, whose name is not given directly, but whose presence shaped the aesthetic of the manor's architecture, established the Carrion tradition in this place. Renala carried it into the academy. Ranni is now carrying something forward from it that neither woman would have predicted, into a future that the towers cannot see. Commander O'Neill, encountered in the heart of the Ionia swamp in Caelid, was once a general of Millennia's army, one of the commanders who led her Cleanrot Knight forces in the battles that preceded and produced the bloom at Aeonia. He is now part of the swamp, or rather the swamp is now part of him, a massive figure wielding an enormous halberd, corrupted by the rot that the bloom released, surrounded by spectral soldiers who fight alongside him, and the specific loyalty of those who followed their commander into the worst possible outcome and have not yet received permission to stop. His presence in the swamp is a memorial and a trap simultaneously. He is there because this is where the battle ended, where the bloom happened, where everything became what it became, and he has not moved from the center of that ending because moving from it would require acknowledging that it is over and that what he represents is a record of failure rather than an ongoing campaign. The soldiers around him are phantoms, in the same way that Commander Niall's sons are phantoms, the dead who persist in the service of those who cannot yet let them rest. The difference is that Niall's grief was transformed into the guarding of a post, which is a form of continuing forward, while O'Neill's is trapped in the center of the catastrophe itself, still fighting the battle that ended in the bloom, still commanding forces that are no longer fully there. The rot that has claimed him has not removed what he was. Under the corruption, the general is still present, still commanding, still orienting his forces, still performing the function that his existence was organized around. The rot works through the existing structure of a person rather than replacing it. What O'Neill does now is what O'Neill always did. It is simply being done in conditions that have made it no longer possible to achieve what the doing was originally for. Margit the Fell Omen, who appears at the entrance to Stormvale Castle to stop the Tarnished's advance, is one of the game's most carefully constructed introductory statements about who and what the player is dealing with in this world. He is powerful beyond the player's early ability to match, condescending in the specific way of someone who has seen many versions of this confrontation before and expects it to end the same way, and explicitly contemptuous of your aspiration to become Elden Lord. He is, as the late game reveals, Morgott, the Omen King of Lindell, the man who was born cursed beneath the capital he devoted his life to defending. His appearance as Margit is a disguise in the literal sense of a changed name and a different presentation, but not a disguise in the sense that conceals who he actually is. Everything Margit does, every choice of weapon and style and rhetorical approach, is entirely consistent with Morgott's character once you know that character. He has been stopping Tarnished at the gates of Stormvale long before the player arrives. This is not implied. It is stated in the various items that speak to his movements and his nature. He has been the final obstacle for an enormous number of would-be Elden Lords, the examination that most failed. He is not being difficult. He is performing a function that he has decided is necessary, preventing those who are not yet ready, or never will be ready, from advancing toward a throne that their inadequacy would make catastrophic. The contempt is real, but it is not simple cruelty. It is the contempt of someone who believes in the thing he is protecting, who believes that the throne of Elden Lord matters enough that the wrong person reaching it would be worse than no one reaching it. He is a guardian who happens to be guarding from the outside while also being one of the things the inside produces. His is perhaps the most structurally peculiar position in the entire game, the cursed child of the system, defending the system from its own failures. The Land of Shadow, introduced in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, exists in a relationship to the main lands between that the DLC characterizes as a kind of reflected darkness, the place where the Erdtree cast its shadow as it grew, where the things it excluded or forgot were gathered and held. Moquella went there in his vessel, carried by Moog. The player follows in the wake of his passage. What the Land of Shadow contains is a history that the main game's lore treats as peripheral. The story of Marika before the Erdtree, the civilization that existed in thee. Shadow's domain before it was a shadow of anything, the figures and powers that the Golden Order's rise displaced or absorbed without acknowledgement. Mesmer the Impaler, who burns in the ruins of a campaign long completed, the Hornsent people who remember a massacre that the Golden Order refuses to record, the Ancient Dragon. Bale, who carries within himself the ancestral fire of all dragonkind, and who does not forget. Ansbach, who moves through the shadow in service of an ideal he has had to separate from its current embodiment as its most articulate navigator. He understands the Land of Shadow as a place where the things the Erdtree could not contain are kept, not as a prison exactly, but as a remainder, the leavings of a process of. Ordering that left things behind. He has come here because the things left behind are in some cases more honest than the things that were kept. The shadow is not simply darkness. It is the darkness that a particular kind of light makes, the specific darkness that only exists because the light is there, defined by the light, shaped by the Erdtrees, presence in a way that makes it both the tree's opposite and its product. You cannot understand the main world without the shadow, and you cannot understand the shadow without the main world that made it. Tanith's history as a dancer from a foreign land, the land of Rana, referenced in item descriptions as a place whose performance traditions produced the specific art form of. The castanets that Patches preserves is the kind of history the game embeds in details small enough to miss, but significant enough that missing them changes what you understand. About the character, she traveled to the lands between, or was brought to it, or found her way there through circumstances the game does not specify, and she found Rykard, or Rykard found her. The specifics of how a dancer from a foreign land became the administrator of a manor of assassins devoted to a blasphemous lord are not spelled out in a single narrative. They are assembled from fragments, from what her model's proportions suggest, and what Raya's necklace indicates, and what the dancer's castanets mean in the context of what Patches chose to preserve after Rykard's death. What seems clear is that she chose completely. Whatever the initial circumstances of her arrival, whatever the process by which she moved from performer to consort to manor administrator, by the time the player encounters her, she has organized her entire existence around Rykard in a way that leaves no room for what came before. The dancer is still in her body, in her proportions, and the castanets that someone who knew her thought to keep, but she does not perform it for anyone anymore. She performs devotion instead, with the same total commitment that a great performer brings to their art. Devotion as performance and performance as devotion are not opposites in the world of the lands between. They are both complete commitments, both the giving of everything to a single thing. Tanith gave herself to her lord, and her lord gave himself to a serpent god, and at the end she was alone in a chamber with what remained. She continued performing her devotion in the only form still available. The audience was gone. The performance continued anyway. The grace that flows through the lands between, the golden light that pools at sites of grace and streams from the Erdtree across the sky, is not simply beautiful. It is administrative. It is the greater will's management system for the world, the mechanism through which life is tracked and death is processed, and the cycle from person to tree to grace to person is maintained. The golden light is the bureaucracy of a cosmic power expressed as warmth. This is not a cynical reading. The warmth is real, and the grace is genuinely sustaining, and the sites of grace are genuinely places of rest. But the mechanism underneath the warmth is administrative, and understanding that mechanism changes what the warmth means. The Erd Tree absorbs the dead not out of love, but out of function. It returns life not out of generosity, but out of maintenance. The grace that feels personal is impersonal in origin, which is perhaps why the people who find the most peace in the lands between are those who find their own small fires and tend them themselves. The sites of grace that the tarnished access are, in this context, something slightly different from the ordinary grace of the Golden Order. They are grace that has been granted to the tarnished specifically, grace that allows return from death in a way that ordinary dead do not experience, grace that sustains the specific project of finding a new Elden Lord. This is the greater will being selective with its administration, providing the tarnished with tools the ordinary dead do not have, because the tarnished serve a function the ordinary dead cannot. There is a final quiet to the lands between that settles over everything after a long enough journey through it. The violence becomes familiar enough to recede into context. The lore becomes rich enough to feel inhabited rather than constructed. The NPCs become people known rather than characters encountered, and in that familiarity, something happens to the experience of the world that the game seems designed to allow. You begin to feel the weight of it. The weight of all these lives carried through all this darkness, the weight of Roderica's survival and Blade's end, and Millicent's choice and Gowry's devotion, and Nephile's reinvention, and Alexander's cheerful march toward his own dissolution, and Fia's tenderness and Hugh's dreaming, and all the others, all the people who stood at their posts and spoke their words, and offered what they had to offer, and received what the world offered in return, which was frequently not enough. Thanks for watching. If these stories helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play. As you close your eyes, you might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.